Chapter 109. If you want to support or read some advanced chapters +10, please follow me on patreon.com/jayjayempi. Forks, Washington. The sky over Forks, as usual, was blanketed by a thick layer of clouds that dulled any hint of sunlight. From inside the Cullen house, that grayish light filtered through the wide windows, filling the space with a dense, artificial calm, as if time itself had paused in a moment of silent waiting. Bella sat at the edge of the couch, hands clasped over her knees, her face tense. There was something restless about her posture, a barely contained nervousness that showed in small gestures, fingers pressing against each other, a slight forward sway of her body, her gaze fixed on an invisible point on the floor. Edward watched her in silence. He had taken a seat beside her minutes ago, trying to comfort her with his presence alone, but he knew that wasn't enough. Bella's anxiety wasn't superficial, it stemmed from something deeper, from the sense of standing at the center of a danger she couldn't control. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and velvety. Victoria won't get away much longer. Carlyle and the others will handle it soon. It's only a matter of time. Bella nodded slowly, though she didn't lift her gaze. Her lips trembled slightly, as if she wanted to say something more but held it back. Edward tilted his head slightly, studying her profile. He didn't need to read her mind to know what she was thinking. I'm thinking about Charlie, too, he said softly, anticipating her. But as long as you and I stay away from town most of the time, he'll be safer. Tonight, when his shift ends, I'll take you home. I'll stay close. He won't be alone. She looked at him then, finally. Her eyes reflected a complex mix of emotions, relief, fear, guilt. She nodded again, this time with a faint sigh that seemed to ease something in her chest. Thank you, she murmured, almost in a whisper. Then, after a brief silence, she looked toward the window, veiled by the overcast sky. Around what time do you think Carlyle and the others will reach Seattle? Edward took a moment to think. He pictured his family's departure that morning, their silent movements, the determination in their faces before disappearing into the trees. The scent of damp earth still lingered in the air when they left. They left early. They shouldn't be far. Maybe they're already close. Bella nodded, but this time her expression darkened. Her lips pressed into a tense line, and her voice came out heavier, weighed down by regret. I should have gone with them. This is all because of me, and yet they're the ones risking everything. Edward turned to her, his expression suddenly hardened by resolve. No, he said, firmly, leaving no room for argument. If you'd gone, you would have been in danger. They would have tried to protect you, and that would have distracted them. You can't be both a target and a burden, Bella. Even Nate won't come near. The name dropped like a stone in a still pond. Nate, Bella repeated with nostalgia, her voice laced with emotion. The name gave her a sense of warmth. Besides Edward, Nate was someone who made her feel safe. She straightened slightly, as if she might stand up, as if merely saying his name could bring him back. Her hands gripped the edge of the couch, and for a moment, her gaze filled with a different kind of anxiety, more personal, more pained. Is he okay? I haven't heard from him in days. He hasn't replied to my last messages. Wait, isn't Alice going to Seattle too? Edward looked at her with careful seriousness, as if choosing his words with extreme caution. She is, he finally replied. But she doesn't want to expose Nate. They told me he'd stay there one more night, then come here. He'll be staying at my place for a few days until this is over. Bella lowered her gaze, thoughtful. Why is he staying here? Edward answered in a firm but calm voice. Alice wants me to watch over him. I can't be going back and forth between your house and his all the time, so he'll stay with me until my family and the Denali confirm it's safe again. Bella looked up with a flicker of relief in her eyes. The thought of Nate returning soon was comforting. There was something about his presence, his calm way of observing the world, that gave her a sense of balance. She hoped that when he returned, he'd tell her everything he'd discovered on his trip, all he'd seen and experienced. She also felt a small pang of curiosity about what it had been like that time alone with Alice. She turned her gaze to Edward's eyes, trying not to seem too inquisitive, but he still caught the intensity in her stare, though he couldn't fully decipher its meaning. Bella slowly looked away, her expression shifting ever so slightly, while a faint shadow passed through her thoughts. Since arriving in Forks, her relationship with Edward had grown in ways she never imagined. She loved him deeply, with a silent devotion that sometimes hurt. But a part of her, quiet and persistent, wondered why they still hadn't crossed certain lines. Why did it feel like he always kept one foot at the edge of the abyss, as if afraid to lose control at any moment? And now, she couldn't help comparing their relationship to that of Nate and Alice. They seemed to complement each other so naturally. Bella had no idea how far they'd gone, but she doubted that after all that time alone, nothing had happened. Unaware of all this, Edward allowed himself a brief smile. Alice was very insistent that I take care of Nate, he said, with a tone that blended surprise and a hint of tenderness. I didn't expect her to act like that. She's always been optimistic, light-hearted, you know. But now she seems different. More protective. She's really worried about her partner. Bella let out a low laugh, laced with soft irony, tilting her head slightly as she looked at him. You're the last person who should say that, she murmured with a smile, amused. Edward let out a brief, sincere laugh. That kind of shared humor felt like a balm, as if their hearts aligned for a moment, outside the danger and uncertainty surrounding them. In that moment, the tension that had hung over the house since morning eased slightly, like a fresh breeze slipping through an invisible crack. The hours passed in a sort of domestic stillness. They chatted about trivial things, shared quiet confidences, and then played a few rounds of chess. Bella insisted that Edward not hold back, despite his initial protests. She lost twice, but enjoyed every moment, watching him move the pieces with an elegance that was almost choreographed, with a focus that mesmerized her. Outside, the sky turned a deep blue, covered with clouds, soaked in silence. Night settled in without asking permission, wrapping the forest trees in its still presence. Edward stood up with the softness of a sigh and looked out the window. Then he turned back to Bella. It's time. Let's go, I'll take you home. Bella nodded with a faint smile and walked with Edward to the Volvo. The car had that polished, almost ghostly metallic sheen. Edward opened the passenger door with an automatic, elegant gesture, and once she was settled in, he slid fluidly into the driver's seat. He started the engine effortlessly, and within seconds, the car was gliding over the pavement, heading toward Bella's house. During the drive, the landscape blurred into a stream of trees and telephone poles, and the hum of the engine wrapped itself in the silence they shared. Bella rested her head against the window for a few seconds, then turned slightly toward him. Once Charlie falls asleep, you can come in through the window, she said, as if it were a completely natural routine. Edward smiled, that glint of complicity softening his face. That was the plan anyway, he replied quietly. Then, with a nearly imperceptible shift in tone, he added, I almost forgot to tell you, at some point tonight I'll stop by Nate's house to do a little patrol. Bella raised an eyebrow, curious. Why? Edward's expression shifted, becoming more somber. His eyes remained on the road, but his voice carried a different kind of seriousness. I owe Nate. Before he left, he asked me to watch over his grandmother. I gave him my word. I've made a few quick visits, just to make sure she's okay, but I don't stay long. I don't want to leave my scent behind. He paused briefly, and a faintly amused smirk touched his lips. Although it's funny, I only passed by the house a couple of times, but Mrs. Winter spotted me immediately. Bella let out a short laugh, picturing the scene. I'm not surprised. That woman doesn't miss a thing. The conversation relaxed, soft phrases and gentle smiles threading between them as the car glided through the nearly deserted streets of Forks. Night had fully settled in by the time they reached Bella's house. Edward turned off the engine, and for a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then they got out silently, walking together toward the entrance. But after only a few steps, Edward stopped cold. Bella immediately felt the tension ripple through his body, as if a jolt had shot from his spine to his fingertips. Before she could ask, he lifted an arm slightly, stopping her with delicate but firm pressure. Wait, he murmured, jaw tight. His eyes flashed with an intensity that chilled Bella to the bone. He inhaled deeply through his nose, brow furrowed, and a shadow of anger crossed his face. I smell a vampire in the house, he said in a low voice, clear as a blade. Before Bella could even process the words, Edward vanished, an almost imperceptible blur of wind and speed, straight toward her bedroom window. The crunch of leaves, a faint whistle of air, and then silence. Bella froze, staring at her window where he'd just disappeared. Her entire body tensed, waiting for a sign, dreading what he might find inside. The night, so quiet just moments before, now seemed to be holding its breath. Edward came out of the house with his lips pressed tight and his brow furrowed. He closed the door harder than necessary and walked back to the car without looking back. Bella followed, heart clenched. What about Charlie? Edward shook his head, still visibly frustrated. Doesn't look like he's been here recently. Bella stopped in her tracks, a chill crawling down her spine. Then, where is he? He was supposed to come straight home after work. Edward avoided her eyes for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly. Let's not jump to conclusions. He might have stayed longer at the station. Let's check. They got back into the Volvo and drove off in silence. Edward rolled the driver's window down just a crack, enough for the damp Forks air to slip inside. He didn't want to alarm Bella, but he needed to stay alert. Very alert. The scent was there. Faint at first. A subtle trace, but unmistakable. Vampire. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if that could calm the tension in his chest. But as they continued, the scent grew clearer, sharper. This wasn't the kind of presence that passed by accident. Edward accelerated. The growl of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence for several minutes. Bella glanced at him sideways. Are you okay? It took him a moment to answer. Yeah, I just want to get there quickly. When they finally pulled up in front of the station, Bella already had her hand on the door handle. She jumped out before the car had fully stopped and ran to the entrance. Edward didn't move at first. He closed his eyes, focusing. The scent was stronger here. Fresh. Almost recent. His expression hardened. Bella returned a few minutes later, breathless. He's not here. Charlie left early. The receptionist said he went to visit Mrs. Winter. Edward straightened instantly. His gaze sharpened like a knife. What is it? Do you think something happened? Bella asked, alarmed by his reaction. I'm coming with you. No, Bella, that's not a good idea. His tone was harsher than intended, but there was no time for softness. Please, Edward. I'm not going to sit here while my dad might be in danger. He looked at her intently, the internal struggle clear in his eyes. He knew leaving her behind was even worse. He nodded with a contained sigh. Fine. But you do exactly what I say. Understood. Understood. They got back in the car. Edward started it up immediately and drove as fast as he could. The Volvo's headlights sliced through the fog like blades, and the silence between them grew thicker. The scent lingered, more persistent than ever. And now, Edward wasn't hiding his concern anymore. He felt it in every fiber of his being. Because that trail wasn't just recent. It was current. The drive was short, thanks to the speed at which Edward was driving. It only took them a few minutes to get there. Edward parked the car in front of the house, the engine still vibrating under the hood. Bella had barely unbuckled her seatbelt when he stretched an arm out in front of her. Wait here. His golden eyes were fixed on the house. From her seat, Bella looked at him in confusion, but Edward wasn't looking at her anymore. His face had hardened, jaw clenched tight. The air thickened, heavy and saturated. Through the crack of the window, a mix of intense smells reached her nose. Fresh blood, the sickly sweet stench of a newborn vampire, and the unmistakable scent of a wolf. Wet dog, earth, and rage. Edward frowned. A gut-wrenching howl echoed from inside, followed by a guttural roar and the crash of something, or someone, slamming into a wall. Wood cracked. Glass shattered. And then Charlie's voice, a scream of pain that sliced through the air like a blade. Bella stirred in her seat, alarmed, but Edward was already out of the car. He crossed the front yard in less than a second. The door was wide open. Inside, the living room was chaos. Overturned furniture, torn curtains, papers flying like leaves caught in a whirlwind. And in the center, a massive copperford wolf stood with jaws bared, growling, its throat soaked in foam and blood. In front of him, a blonde vampire with an athletic build faced off, face twisted, fangs exposed. His sweatshirt was ripped, and his sunglasses were lost among the wreckage. Edward caught their thoughts in a blink. The wolf's mind was a storm. Erratic, wild. It was all screams, impulses, rage. Destroy. Kill. Protect. He recognized him instantly. Jacob Black. The vampire, on the other hand, was thinking in panic, every thought a spark of fear. Victoria. I have to get back to Victoria. He'll kill me. He can kill me. Edward tensed, ready to launch, but a stronger scent stopped him cold. Blood. He turned his head. Against a broken shelf, Mrs. Winter lay on the floor, pale as wax, a trickle of blood escaping her parted lips. Her pulse was weak, but she was breathing. On the other side of the room, Charlie was unconscious, half buried under the shattered remains of a table. His chest rose and fell slowly, but a dark, thick stream ran from his forehead and dripped onto the carpet. Edward's fury paused for a heartbeat. He couldn't let the vampire escape, but he couldn't ignore the injured, either. Every nerve in his body demanded he act, attack, end this. But one wrong move could cost lives. He approached Charlie, who was closest. The smell of blood was overwhelming, almost solid in the air, as if it had soaked into the very walls. It was dense, metallic, suffocating. Charlie's body lay slumped against the wall. He was still breathing, but barely. Then, a brutal thud snapped Edward's attention back. The vampire, with a single motion, backhanded the massive wolf. The impact boomed like thunder. Jacob flew across the room, crashing into the dining table, which exploded into splinters. The wooden legs cracked like breaking bones. The wolf rolled through glass and rubble, gouging the floor, but rose almost immediately, breathing heavily, foamy drool spilling from his jaws. Jacob lifted his snout and sniffed. The moment he caught Edward's scent near Charlie, he growled, deep, threatening. His glowing amber eyes flashed with hatred and confusion. Edward heard his thoughts like a stampede of screams, incoherent images, shards of memory, fear, and raw fury. No logic. Only instinct. Jacob, I'm not your enemy. Listen to me. You have to stop. Edward sawed firmly, locking eyes with him. But the wolf lunged. It was like a gunshot, a blur of muscle, claws, and teeth. Edward barely dodged the first swipe that whistled past his head and gouged a deep line in the wall. The second blow struck his chest, and he went down hard, Jacob's full weight crashing on top of him with a sickening crunch. They struggled in the dust and debris. Jacob's claws raked for his throat, his chest, anything vulnerable, while Edward wrestled back, arms braced against the beast's body, pushing with everything he had to hold him off. The wolf's strength was staggering. Edward could feel the muscles trembling under the fur. A fang scraped his cheek, carving a shallow gash. Jacob, stop. He's getting away. Edward shouted, feeling himself losing ground. The vampire, in the back of the room, seized the chance. With supernatural speed, he leapt toward the window and burst through it in one motion, leaving a shower of glass in his wake. He's leaving. He's getting away. Edward cried in desperation, turning his head just enough to see the shattered window, knowing that every second counted. But Jacob didn't let go. He kept Edward pinned to the floor, his jaws so close that Edward could see strands of saliva stretched between his fangs. He was out of control. The door slammed open, and a scream split the air. Edward. It was Bella. She ran inside, panting, eyes wide at the scene. She saw the bodies on the ground, the blood, and Edward struggling beneath a hairy monster the size of a bear. The wolf froze. His body trembled. He turned his head just slightly. His eyes met Bella's. He hesitated, took a step back, then another. His paws dragged slowly across the floor, shaking his head violently, as if fighting something inside him. The growl in his throat softened, warping into a sound closer to a whimper. He looked at Edward one last time, and then, with a powerful leap, jumped through the same window as the vampire, vanishing into the darkness. Edward got up at once, the wound on his cheek already closing. He was about to run after them, but Bella's voice held him in place. Edward, please, she sobbed, kneeling beside Charlie. We have to get them to a hospital, please. Mrs. Winter, she needs help too. He turned to look at her, kneeling in blood, hands pressed to Charlie's head, face crumpled in anguish. Across the room, Mrs. Winter murmured something under her breath, bleeding out inches from a collapsed bookshelf. And Bella, in the middle of it all, was trembling. Shattered. Edward closed his eyes just for a second. A tense breath escaped his lips. And then, with evident frustration, he moved toward them. What followed was an amalgam of short, vague answers. With Carlisle out of town, they had no choice but to call an ambulance. The fact that the local sheriff had been injured was scandalous enough for the news to spread like wildfire across Forks. Not only did paramedics arrive at the Winter's house, but several patrol cars too. Red and blue lights washed over the windows like intermittent heartbeats. Edward and Bella said they had come to visit a friend's grandmother and found the house in that state. The most solid, and most convenient, theory was that a wild animal had broken in, attacking the occupants before fleeing when confronted. The officers, though skeptical, couldn't deny that something violent had occurred inside. The claw marks and loose fur supported the theory. However, the final version of the story depended on just one thing. That Charlie woke up and could tell them what he remembered. Both he and Mrs. Winter were taken to the nearest hospital. Charlie had a severe head contusion, several broken ribs, and bruises across his torso. Mrs. Winter was in even more delicate condition. Her advanced age had turned every bone to glass. The fall had left her with internal injuries requiring immediate intervention. Edward and Bella remained in the hospital hallway for hours, silent, never leaving each other's side. Night slowly fell over Forks, wrapping everything in an almost tangible gloom. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant, and the only sounds were the occasional footsteps of nurses gliding through the corridors like shadows. Finally, a doctor approached them, removing his latex gloves with a tired gesture. He told them they could go in to see the patients. They didn't hesitate. Charlie's room was white and sterile, save for the monitor blinking with each heartbeat, emitting a steady beep. Charlie lay still, unconscious, a bandage wrapped around his head, breathing through his mouth. Bella knelt beside the bed, tears running uncontrollably down her cheeks. She took his hand with reverent delicacy, as if afraid she might break him by touch alone. She began to whisper apologies, her voice broken, the words chopped by choking sobs that barely formed coherent sentences. She clung to her father's hand as if she could anchor him to the world by touch alone, as if that contact could bring him back. The tears didn't stop, soaking the white sheet by his arm. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered again and again, buried in guilt, her forehead resting on the edge of the bed. "I'm so sorry for all of this." Edward stood a few steps behind her, rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on Charlie. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. Then he slowly knelt and wrapped his arms around her from behind, holding her gently. Bella didn't resist. She collapsed into him like someone who could no longer hold herself up. "It's my fault," Edward murmured, his voice low and tense, speaking into her ear. "I was the one who pulled you into this world, I heard him. I heard the vampire's thoughts, he was coming for you. Victoria sent him." Bella didn't respond, but her sobs intensified for a moment, a spasm of pain rippling through her. She remained pressed against Charlie, still holding his hand, while Edward closed his eyes, feeling an icy stab twist in his chest. This was the price. This was what it meant to fall in love with a human. Not just putting her at risk, but dragging everyone she loved down with her. For several minutes, Edward didn't move. He just held her in silence, letting their guilt mix into a shared emptiness. The heart monitor marked time with each dry beep, breaking the silence like an artificial pulse. When he noticed Bella's sobs beginning to subside, he spoke in a barely audible voice. "I'm going to check on Mrs. Winter." Bella lifted her face slightly, her eyes red from crying. She said nothing, just nodded weakly, still trembling, still clinging to Charlie. Edward stood, casting one last glance at the unconscious man in the bed, and stepped out silently. His footsteps echoed softly down the corridor as he made his way to Mrs. Winter's room. Just as he reached the door, a doctor emerged, drying his hands with a crumpled cloth. Edward recognized him immediately. "You're Dr. Cullen's son, right?" The man asked, his voice heavy with tension, face exhausted. Edward nodded stiffly, feeling the pressure in his chest grow. "How is she?" The doctor looked down for a second, as if searching the floor for a less cruel way to say it. "We did everything we could. But, she's very weak. Whatever hit her did too much damage. All we can do now is keep her under observation and hope for the best." The sentence hung in the air like a sealed verdict. Edward took a deep breath. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated a moment, then silently stepped aside. Edward entered. The smell of alcohol and metal hit him immediately. The hum of machines was the only thing breaking the thick silence. Mrs. Winter lay there, motionless, pale as a winter leaf, wrapped in white sheets, her body reduced to fragile bones and withered skin. Monitors blinked lifelessly around her, as if they too knew time was running out. Edward approached slowly, every step measured, as if the slightest sound could shatter what little life remained. He studied her closely. Her lips barely trembled, her eyelids fluttered as if struggling to open. She wasn't fully unconscious. He could feel it, not just from the soft murmur on her lips, but from the mental waves escaping her weakened mind like distant echoes. Broken thoughts, frayed memories, her husband, her son, and always, always Nate. The woman hovered between two worlds, clinging to the frayed threads of life with her fingernails. Edward felt the guilt building up inside. He hadn't just failed a kind soul like hers, he'd also failed Nate. Nate, who, despite being human, had given everything to protect Bella, the girl he loved. Edward felt powerless, unable to return the favor even with all his gifts. Then, the voice of Mrs. Winter emerged from the sound of the machines. Barely a whisper, ragged, like each word tore a piece of soul from her. "Please, forgive me." Edward frowned, leaning closer, listening carefully to every breath escaping her dry throat. Mrs. Winter cried in silence. Her cheeks trembled with small, warm tears. Her broken voice insisted. Forgive me, Nathaniel, I don't want to leave you alone. Edward felt something break inside him, a void opening that couldn't be closed. He knelt beside her bed, took her hand in his, and held it with the greatest care he could. Despite the fragility of her touch, she responded with a faint squeeze, the last act of love her weakened body could offer. The silence became unbearable. The pain of another engulfed him, drowned him. Edward felt as though he were grieving. All he wanted was to ease this woman's pain. It took him a few seconds to make his decision. With a trembling voice, adopting the tenderness Nate would have used, he leaned in and whispered in her ear. I promise I'll be okay, Grandma. Then, as if those words had brought her peace, her breathing grew calmer. A soft, almost childlike, smile appeared on her lips. It lasted barely a second. Then her face relaxed completely. The line on the monitor went flat. A sharp, cold beep sliced through the air. Edward didn't move. He stayed there, holding her hand, as if sheer will could return warmth to her fingers. But it was useless. He knew it instantly. Death was already in the room, wrapping everything in its still breath. The doctors burst in. They tried to revive her. Edward stepped back in silence, just another shadow among the shadows. The beeping continued. Finally, the doctor lowered his arms, exhausted, defeated. He looked at the nurse with resigned eyes and said, Please note the time of death. At those words, Edward squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't know what to do. The weight of the moment pressed down on his chest, as if all the air in the hallway had vanished. The doctor, still speaking softly and with respect, asked, Do you know if she has any relatives we should inform? Edward nodded slowly, as if every movement hurt. She only has one, but he's out of town. The doctor nodded with understanding, then turned to a nurse and told her to take down the number to make the call. But before she could write anything, Edward spoke, his voice uncertain, almost pleading. Excuse me, he's my friend. Could I be the one to tell him? The doctor and nurse exchanged a quiet glance. It wasn't standard procedure, but the sorrow etched into the young man's face, the dim glow in his golden eyes, said more than words ever could. After a moment of silence, the doctor gave a gentle nod. All right. Edward bowed his head in gratitude, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped into the hallway without looking back. His steps were steady, but his soul dragged behind him under the weight of a broken promise. He stopped beside the wall, took a deep breath, and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. His fingers moved slowly, ready to dial. He knew what came next wouldn't be easy. He knew he was about to break Nate's heart. Chapter 110. Washington, D.C. The knife remained buried in Ymir's heart, barely vibrating under the unyielding pressure of the Romanions' cold, pale hands. The cry that tore from the lycanthrope was a primal roar, overflowing with anguish, ripping through the silence of the alley like a crack in time. It was the lament of a creature that did not want to die, that fought against the inevitable with an ancient fury. His body convulsed in violent spasms, every muscle fiber straining, waging a hopeless war against death. His limbs, trapped by the vampiric grip, could do little more than tremble in desperation. The veins in his neck stood out like dry branches, and his throat released strangled growls, weaker with each passing moment. Then his eyes found Nate's. There was no hatred in them. No rage. No resentment. Only fear. Deep, genuine fear. A silent plea. A question without an answer. And then, suddenly, as if a flame had been extinguished from within, Ymir went still. Life left him in an instant. The light vanished from his pupils, the tension drained from his muscles, and no more air escaped his parted lips. The roar became absolute silence. The Romanions released their grip with the cold precision of those carrying out an ancient ritual. The werewolf's lifeless body collapsed to the ground with a dull thud that felt like the closing of an irrevocable chapter. After a few seconds, they released Nate's hand, still clenched around the knife's hilt, and stepped back solemnly. Their faces were emotionless marble, but in their red eyes flickered something dark, a silent, profound, ritualistic satisfaction. Nate slowly lowered his gaze. His fingers were still trembling as he pulled the blade from Ymir's chest with a mechanical gesture, as if the body might still react. The blade was stained with warm, thick, still fresh blood. That same knife had ended another life, James's. But then, it had been different. Edward had dealt the final blow. He had merely been part of the process. Not now. Not this time. There was no doubt. He had killed a man. One who, despite everything, had only wanted to live. A storm of emotions battered him from within. Guilt, heavy as lead. Rage, like a fire with no outlet. And, though he didn't want to admit it, relief. A cold, piercing relief that chilled his lungs. He had avenged his father. Nate closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The air was heavy with moisture, thick as a shroud. A raindrop landed on his forehead. Then another. And another. The sky had begun to cry. As if it shared his burden, or judged him. He opened his eyes. His voice came out low, restrained, as if it pained him to speak. Why did you do that? Vladimir was the first to respond. His voice was deep, ancient, carved from centuries of pain and conviction. We did it for you, Nathaniel. Stefan spoke immediately after, his tone mirroring his companion's, his eyes sharp as daggers. We couldn't let doubt wither what you were meant to become. Vladimir walked slowly to the corpse, inclining his head slightly, like one contemplating an offering. You delivered justice with your own hands. You felt it. We know you did. That precise moment when his heart stopped. It was yours. Yours alone. Stefan allowed a faint smile to form, barely a twitch on his immutable face. It is a son's duty to avenge his father. And you, Nathaniel, you have fulfilled it. Nate didn't answer. His hands were still trembling. He clenched his fists tightly. The rain pelted his face, but it could not wash away the invisible blood he felt on him. He deserved it, he murmured, almost inaudibly. But he told the truth. His words dissolved into the rainfall. My father, he wouldn't have wanted this. Vladimir looked at him with an inscrutable expression before replying. Your father was an impressive man, even brave. But he was also weak. Weakness was his downfall. Stefan stepped closer, his voice soft but no less cutting. That weakness destroyed him. And your mother. Had he accepted our power, had he not clung to his pathetic humanity. Nate's fury exploded like lightning. He stepped forward, eyes ablaze. How dare you? His humanity wasn't a weakness. His voice cracked, but he didn't back down. You're so blinded by vengeance you can't see what he did have. Love, compassion. He had a family. He had something real. Something no power can ever replace. Vladimir didn't blink. His voice dropped, and with it, the temperature around them. That love didn't protect him when the wolf tore through him. Stefan added, a shadow of irony in his voice. And compassion didn't save your mother when she screamed his name, for the last time. Nate lowered his head. He shut his eyes tightly, as if that could erase the thought. But silence only made their words heavier. Then Vladimir stepped forward and stood in front of him. His red eyes gleamed with supernatural intensity. Tell me, Nathaniel, when you felt his heart give out beneath your hand, when you saw that he would never breathe again. He tilted his head slightly. Didn't you feel peace? Wasn't it pleasurable? Nate swallowed hard, unable to respond. Stefan moved beside him. His tone was gentler now, like a maternal voice whispering from within a nightmare. We are not monsters. We are not blind beasts. We are consequences. What you've done tonight. He gestured lightly toward the body. Is exactly what we have waited centuries to witness. Vladimir nodded solemnly. Justice. The rain had become a shroud, covering everything, making Nate's hair stick to his forehead, just enough to hide the shadow of doubt in his eyes. Vladimir stepped back slightly, as if making way for a new truth. Your father has been avenged. The wolf breathes no more. Stefan leaned slightly toward the corpse. But he was only a tool. A disposable weapon. Vladimir looked toward the darkness at the end of the alley. His voice turned coarse, like crushed stone. The real killers still live. Untouched. Untouchable. Stefan lowered his voice, and with it, the world seemed to stop. The ones who killed your mother, the ones who condemned your father, laugh from their marble thrones at your loss and your pain. Both fixed their gaze on Nate. And then, in unison, with chilling synchronicity, their voices merged. The Volturi. The name sent an involuntary shiver down Nate's spine. He could almost see them in his mind, haughty and eternal figures, eyes cold as blades, looking at his parents as if they were nothing. As if their lives had held no value. The memory of his mother smiling in the kitchen. His father was humming an old song while cleaning the windshield. Both were murdered because of a decision made in a marble hall, dictated with disdain. A spark of pure anger pierced Nate's chest like a heated dagger. But he held himself back. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, letting the rain cool his skin and his mind. Then he spoke, not shouting, but with a firmness born of conflict. I'm not throwing myself headfirst into a bottomless pit. Not when I have people to protect. I have friends. I have a family, and I have my partner. He paused, swallowing hard, as if the words needed extra weight to stay grounded. Revenge isn't worth it if it means risking everything I love. I'll always carry what the Volturi did. And I truly hope you get what you're after. I won't forget how you helped me today, or the answers you gave me, but I'm not going to risk the lives of my loved ones for a war where I have nothing to gain, and everything to lose. Though his tone was calm, a thin thread of doubt ran through his voice. As if he wasn't only speaking to them, but trying to convince himself. Vladimir stepped forward, frustrated, brows furrowed, eyes burning. He was about to speak, but Stefan raised a hand in his direction, silencing him without a word. The rain drew diagonal lines across his long dark coat as he turned to Nate with a voice that was almost friendly, serene, but dangerously persuasive. You want to sound like your father, Nathaniel. But you are not him. Nate clenched his jaw. We saw it before the wolf even tried to run. When you faced him, you already had your suspicions. Your movements, your eyes, you knew. Vladimir smiled slowly, immediately understanding where Stefan was going. He stepped forward and added in a deeper voice, with that theatrical cadence that so defined him. Your goal was to buy time, we get that. But you enjoyed every second. You faked weakness. Gave him the upper hand. Let him grow confident. Stefan continued, a gloomy glint in his eyes. And then, when he felt invincible, you took everything from him. It wasn't uncontrolled rage. It was a choice. Execution. Because deep down, you had already reached the conclusion that he had killed your parents. Vladimir tilted his head slightly, a smile not of mockery, but of deep understanding. You made him pay, and now you come to us saying you don't want to finish what you started. Silence spread between them like the rain, each word echoing on the wet stone ground, in Nate's ragged breath, in the distant echo of his own conscience. Nate didn't know what to say. He knew. He had known from the beginning. Even if he tried to convince himself otherwise, even if he clung to reason, a part of him, deep and quiet, knew the truth. There was something dark inside him. Something that didn't just want revenge, but craved to inflict pain. Something that wanted to do to the Volturi what he did to the werewolf. Only worse. Much worse. He took a few steps back, as if the ground were beginning to tilt beneath his feet. His mind throbbed violently, thoughts and emotions crashed into each other like thunder in a storm. The Romanions said nothing. They remained still, like statues carved from ancient marble, offering no judgment, only watching. Their eyes were needles piercing his soul. Nate ran both hands through his hair, almost in desperation, as if trying to rip out the thoughts. The conflict in his head hurt. It wasn't symbolic, it was real pain, blows, hammers shaking his judgment, his reason, his essence. Then something broke the spiral, the soft, familiar tone of his phone. The sound, so mundane, so human, clashed with the heavy atmosphere. Nate thought of ignoring it. His heart was already pierced by too many doubts to care about a call. But then he remembered, at the bar. Hours ago. He hadn't replied to Alice's message. Maybe it was her. The thought alone was enough to let a breeze slip through the storm. Her voice. Her laughter. Her words. She always had that effect. She calmed him more than any strategy, more than any victory. He pulled out the phone quickly, as if just holding it brought hope. But when he saw who was calling, he froze. Edward. For a second, he thought he had read it wrong. But no. It was his name. A direct call. The first time he had ever called him. He never had before. The Romanions watched him. There was no offense in their faces. No reproach. On the contrary, both tilted their heads slightly, attentive. Interested. Nate answered the call with a furrowed brow, still wrapped in the storm of emotions tearing through him. On the other end, there was nothing. Not a breath, not a whisper. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake, a pocket dial. But then, after a pause so long it began to feel ominous, Edward spoke. Nate, I'm sorry for calling so late, Edward Said, his voice tight, broken by something deeper than exhaustion. I didn't know how to tell you this. But I had to do it now. It wouldn't be right for you to find out later. Nate's heart began to pound, thundering in his chest. Something in Edward's cadence, some mix of guilt and resignation, triggered his darkest alarms. I'm here, he murmured, throat dry, a knot tightening in his stomach. Tell me. Edward hesitated. It was clear he was searching for the right words, trying to soften the inevitable. But there was no way to disguise it. When he spoke again, his voice was a tense, restrained whisper. I'm sorry, Nate. I didn't think through all the possibilities. A brief, suffocating pause. Then he continued quickly, like he had to get it all out before collapsing. I took Bella to my house. I thought that, with my family away, it would be safer if I isolated her. If I kept her away from other humans, there'd be fewer risks. But, a newborn appeared. I read his mind. He was one of Victoria's. The pieces began to fall into place slowly in Nate's mind, like fragments of a photograph he didn't want to see. His chest felt like a nailed-shut box. I think he was after Charlie, but he was with your grandmother. And with Jacob. I tried to stop him. Jacob, he transformed. Everything descended into chaos. I couldn't do anything. The tension overflowed in Nate's muscles. He placed a hand against the nearest wall. His voice came out hoarse, barely controlled. Edward, please, be direct. On the other end, Edward took a deep breath. Then, in a low, almost defeated tone, he dropped the words like a stone into a deep lake. I'm sorry. I couldn't keep my promise. Your grandmother, she's dead. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. The world suddenly stood still. There was no scream, no tears, no immediate reaction. Everything inside Nate froze. The pain didn't come. Only a solid, opaque, unbearable nothingness. As if something had ripped the soul from his body and left only the shell behind. The phone slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a dry thud. It bounced once and then went still, like him. Not moving. Not blinking. Not breathing. Everything remained silent for long minutes. The rain kept falling, filling the alley with its constant murmur, as if the world had shrunk to that monotonous, relentless sound. Nate, still leaning against the damp brick wall, didn't move. He felt the water trailing down his face, until he noticed that some droplets were warmer. They weren't coming from the sky. They were his. Silent tears, blending with the rain, tracing invisible lines across his skin. A few meters away, the Romanions watched everything with growing interest. They said nothing at first. Just observed, attentive, like witnesses to someone else's tragedy. Finally, Vladimir broke the silence with a tone of near scientific curiosity, devoid of compassion. Was your grandmother someone close? Nate didn't answer right away. He kept his forehead against the wall, as if the concrete could hold up his soul. Only after a few seconds did he murmur. She was all the family I had left. Stefan stepped forward, his tone deeper, heavier, weighted with judgment. And you left her alone. Without protection. Nate's voice cracked. The tears kept falling, but his voice tried to stay steady, as if he needed to justify every word, every decision. I wasn't supposed to be gone that long, the Cullens were there. Edward was supposed to protect her. The Romanions didn't respond. They simply walked toward him slowly, like shadows wrapping around him. When they reached his side, one stood to his right, the other to his left. Nate didn't move. His forehead was still pressed to the wall, rain pounding against his back, grief soaking into his bones. Vladimir, with a final step, crushed the phone lying on the ground. The crunch was sharp, like a sentence passed. The screen shattered beneath his boot. Stefan was the first to speak, his voice soft, almost comforting. Don't blame poor Edward, Nathaniel. Vladimir followed immediately, his voice as hard as marble. You can't blame him when all the blame is yours. Nate opened his eyes. What shone in them now wasn't pain. It was fury. Without thinking, he stepped back and turned to throw a punch directly at Vladimir's face. The impact was brutal, but only for him. Vladimir didn't flinch. Didn't move. Didn't even blink. For Nate, it was like punching a block of granite. Pain shot up his arm like an electric surge. He was almost certain he'd broken his hand, but the rage was stronger than any fracture. Shut up. He shouted, breathing heavily through clenched teeth. Vladimir let out a short, dry, cruel laugh. Stefan spoke, his eyes never leaving Nate. What he says isn't a lie, Nathaniel. Your parents' deaths, that was out of your control. Vladimir nodded slowly, his mocking expression unchanged. But your grandmother's blood, that's on your hands. Nate took another step back. His gaze was a whirlwind. He clutched his injured hand with the other, as if trying to hold together the fracture, or his own mind. Vladimir stepped forward. How long have you been with that vampire? How long have you had access to a bite? Stefan followed him, his voice merciless. You clung to your useless humanity, just like your father. And now, you've paid the price. Nate raised his eyes with renewed anger, but Vladimir lifted a hand, cutting him off before he could speak. Or tell me I'm wrong. If you had our capabilities, do you think you would have let anyone even get near her? Stefan finished, voice firm, emotionless. And even if you had left, with our abilities, do you really think it would have taken you that long to find the wolf? Nate was about to reply, rage barely contained in his throat, when a shadow crossed his mind. Doubt. He had always known the extent of his abilities. Since he was a child, he'd been stronger, faster, smarter. His mind, his greatest weapon, had been able to devise strategies that cornered beings far more powerful. He never considered himself arrogant, but there were truths even he couldn't deny. If he'd had the vampires' abilities that day in the clearing when they first met James, he knew it well, not one of them would have escaped. If he'd had them in Phoenix, he would have finished Victoria before she ran off and built her army. If only he'd had them when he arrived in Washington, he would have found the wolf in days, not weeks. He would have made it back in time. He would have torn the bastard who killed his grandmother apart with his own hands. But all of that was in the past. A chain of missed opportunities now weighs like stones on his chest, dragging him down with guilt and remorse. The Romanions watched him silently, observing how his gaze drifted into the void. Then, they looked at each other. A barely noticeable curve at the corners of their lips betrayed the subtle smile they shared. In a soft, almost affectionate tone, Stefan spoke first, his voice a whisper that sounded far more compassionate than it truly was. And now that you've not only lost your parents, but your grandmother as well. Vladimir finished the sentence, with that cruel cadence masked as sweetness. You're about to lose your mate, too. Nate looked up. With sorrow, he muttered, unsure. She said they have it under control, her family will protect her. Stefan gave a falsely sweet smile, like someone gently scolding a naive child. We've told you already, Nathaniel, newborns are hard to kill, even for experienced vampires. There are no guarantees. Vladimir picked up the thread, voice low and sharp. Do you blindly trust that they'll keep her safe? The same way they kept your grandmother safe. The words struck with surgical precision. Nate went still, eyes slightly wide, as if something had just clicked inside him. The realization hit him like a brick. With everything he was feeling, he even felt dizzy. He had lost his whole family. And now, he was losing the trust he'd placed in the Cullens. His eyes fixed on a distant point in the alley, while his mind shuffled through options, each more desperate than the last. He couldn't lose anyone else. Not again. Not her. That's when the Romanians stepped closer, one on either side, whispering in his ears with a venomous cadence, like demons speaking from the shadows. And do you know what the worst part is, Nathaniel? Stefan whispered slowly, letting each word sink in. Vladimir continued without pause. How convenient all of this is. Stefan tilted his head as if sharing a secret. Among the rules that Italian trash imposed when they took over was that deaths shouldn't draw attention. Vladimir resumed, his voice laced with false innocence. That's why vampires travel in small groups, constantly moving. Too many deaths would raise suspicions, and the Volturi would come to enforce order. A pause. A charged silence. But now, with the trail an army leaves behind, conveniently, they haven't shown up. Vladimir turned to Stefan, as if posing something curious, almost amusing. You know, there are no covens near Phoenix right now. The closest are the Cullens. Stefan raised his brows, as if just now understanding. It's almost like the Volturi are allowing it. And why would they do that, Vladimir? Stefan asked with theatrical confusion, as if the idea shocked him. Vladimir smirked, crooked. I don't know, but wouldn't it be a shame if someone trimmed down the Cullen coven? They're the second largest after the Volturi themselves. Stefan chuckled softly. Eliminating an entire coven just because they have a few extra members. That would be excessive. Vladimir narrowed his eyes, his smile turning more sinister. I don't think it's all of them. That Edward saw eat on the phone he reads minds, didn't he? That sounds convenient. And the girl, added Stefan, thoughtfully, I'd never heard of anyone having visions. If they had no coven to return to. Vladimir finished the sentence in a murmur dripping with intent. They'd have no reason to resist joining the Volturi Guard, would they? Nate raised his voice, forcing himself to sound firm even though his words trembled inside. That's all speculation. You have no proof that any of this is happening. Stefan gave him a calm, almost patronizing smile, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand how the game was played. And you're going to bet your mate's life, just because you have no proof. Vladimir leaned in slightly, his eyes gleaming with a cruelty disguised as reason. Even if the Volturi aren't involved, do you have any guarantee they won't come for her later? Nate clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Vladimir continued, voice deeper now. I don't know if you were aware, Nathaniel, but the Volturi's dog, he used to belong to the coven of an old acquaintance of ours, Amun, the Egyptian. Stefan picked up seamlessly, like they were finishing each other's thoughts. Amun never understood how it happened, but they found out about the boy's gift, and ripped him from his coven. Almost too easily. Vladimir took a step forward, approaching Nate with serene yet cruel eyes. What guarantee do you have that they won't do the same to your mate? If she's as valuable as we believe, do you really think they won't want her among their ranks? Nate lowered his gaze for a moment. The air felt heavier, as if merely speaking of that uncertain future brought it closer. Stefan let out a soft, joyless chuckle. So, the way we see it. Vladimir followed seamlessly, as if a single voice split between two mouths. Even if your mate survives the army of newborns, there's no guarantee she won't become a target of the Volturi later on. Maybe not this year, maybe not this century. Stefan completed the thought with an almost melancholic whisper. But as long as their ambition exists, their thirst for power, she will never be safe. Vladimir stared at him, his expression hard and final. So tell me, Nathaniel, are you going to let them take everything you love from you again? Nate clenched his fists tightly, ignoring the pain surging through his fractured hand. A thin trail of blood slid down his wrist, dripping onto the ground. His lips trembled, but his voice came out rough, a rasping growl dragged from deep within his chest. No. The Romanians smiled, pleased. It was exactly what they had hoped for. They approached with the slow confidence of those who have no need to rush, certain that the moment belonged to them. Their voices intertwined with unnatural synchronicity, as if they shared the same thought across two minds. Not only will we give you power, began Stefan, his voice deep and seductive. Your enemies will become our enemies, continued Vladimir, never breaking eye contact with Nate. No one will take someone you love from you again. Not the newborns, not a bitter vampire, added Stefan, with a touch of venomous mockery. Not even the Volturi, Vladimir said, firm as a vow. You'll have the strength to never be trampled again, murmured Stefan, in a smooth, tempting tone. And with our support, everything you plan will come to pass, Vladimir concluded, each word dropping like a poisoned promise. All we ask, they whispered together, almost reverently. Will you fulfill our dream? Nate didn't answer. He remained still, his gaze distant, shoulders tense. Then, slowly, his legs gave out. He fell to his knees on the cold, damp cobblestones of the alley. He raised his arms, at first clumsily, as if part of him still resisted. But then, amidst the chaos in his mind, one image emerged with overwhelming clarity, Alice. Her face. Her voice. Her absence. And that was enough. He steadied his arms, raising them toward the Romanians, offering them without a word. Stefan took one. Vladimir took the other. They opened their mouths in unison, fangs glinting under the dim light. And just before they bit down, Vladimir looked up with a spark of celebration in his eyes. To our new ally, Stefan. Stefan responded with a smile that didn't bother to hide the monster beneath his skin. To our first step toward the fall of the Volturi. And then, in perfect synchrony, they sank their fangs into Nate's forearms. The alley was filled with screams. Endless, torn, inhuman screams. Meanwhile, the wheels of fate began to turn with renewed force. As if the decisions made that very night carried enough weight to change everything. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 111. Alice's POV. Alice had only been in Seattle for a few hours, but the discomfort in her chest was constant, sharp, like an invisible dagger stabbing with every thought. The feeling never left her for a moment, an oppressive weight that kept her from breathing calmly, a persistent knot growing with every second. Even though she was surrounded by her family at the hotel where they were staying, the soft murmur of familiar voices, the familiar scent of the Cullens, and the distant hum of the city, nothing could soothe the restlessness she had carried with her since Washington, D.C. Everything had happened so fast. The plan with the Romanions, Nate's decision to stay, the urgency to capture the werewolf. He insisted firmly, as he always did, assuring her he would be fine, that it was the best option. But Alice wasn't convinced. Since she met the Romanions, those ancient vampires from another era, a bad feeling had settled inside her. They weren't like the other vampires she had known in her long life. There was something dark, something almost primal and hungry in their eyes, a disturbing mix of patience and threat. It wasn't just their strong accent, their worn clothes that seemed to tell centuries of history, or the way their eyes glowed with a smoldering fire. It was that intangible aura surrounding every one of their movements, like shadows that had learned to wait, watchful, patient, and lethal. Although she never said it aloud, Alice feared their interest in Nate went deeper than the simple need to catch a wild creature. Sometimes she wondered if the werewolf plan was just an excuse to keep him close, to control him. She felt very reluctant to leave him with them, but still, she did because she trusted him. Because she loved him. She tried to distract herself amid that whirlwind of emotions. She talked with Esme, whose usual warmth offered a brief respite. Helped Rosalie with some last-minute preparations for the upcoming operation, shared battle strategies with Jasper, seeking in his logic and calm a point of support. Even Carlyle, with his serene and measured tone, tried to cheer her up by updating her on what had happened during her absence, trying to illuminate the darkness of her thoughts with facts and explanations. But nothing could pull her out of the latent tension consuming her from within. As the afternoon wore on, the Denali clan informed that they would be delayed a little longer. Alice gritted her teeth, feeling frustration compress her chest. Had she known about the delay, she would have postponed her trip. She could have stayed one more night with Nate. I was there when he went after the wolf. Supported him in person. But now all that was just a stabbing regret. The sun slowly set, dyeing the sky a dull red that announced night's arrival. And with it, desperation began to grow inside Alice, like a slow sentence taking over her thoughts. In her mind, she replayed over and over every word Nate had said before they parted. She tried to find him in her visions, but found only darkness, a dense, impenetrable veil, like the shadow wolves leave behind. That darkness made her even more anxious, filling her with terrible unease, a void that seemed to swallow her whole. At 10 o'clock at night, she sent the first message. A simple sentence, something casual, carefully written not to sound too worried. But there was no reply. At midnight, she sent another message. Then another. At 4 in the morning, anxiety overcame her. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed his number. The operator's automated voice answered coldly. This number is out of service. Alice sat motionless at the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the phone screen as if expecting magic to light it up and show some sign of life. At 5, she called again. Nothing. She hugged the pillow against her chest, feeling how fear gnawed at her from inside, slow and corrosive, like acid devouring hope. It was then, just before dawn, that she called Edward. He answered on the first ring. Did Nate tell you what time his flight to Forks was? She asked bluntly, her voice tense. Edward took a few seconds to respond, long enough for Alice to know something was wrong. No, but, he said softly, almost out of breath. I called him a few hours ago. His grandmother, Mrs. Winter, passed away. I was with her when it happened. I told Nate as soon as it did. Alice closed her eyes, her soul shrinking in her chest. She felt a dull, genuine pain that pierced her mercilessly. Mrs. Winter had always been kind to her, treating her like family, with a warmth that, even when they weren't sure what she and Nate were, was undeniable. That woman had embraced her in moments of uncertainty, and now she was gone. She swallowed hard, unable to say anything at first. Only heavy, thick silence filled the line for a few seconds. And what did Nate say? She finally murmured. Nothing, Edward replied. His voice carried a guilt Alice hadn't heard before. When I told him, he stayed on the line for a few minutes, then hung up. I tried calling him back later, but his number was out of service. I thought maybe he blocked me or something. After all, I failed him. Alice pressed her lips tightly. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he did what he could. But all she could think was that Nate was alone. Alone with that pain, with that loss, surrounded by those ancient vampires who hunted him like hungry crows. She had no idea where he was or what he was doing. And that tore her apart. She fell sideways onto the bed, clutching a pillow desperately. Her chest ached even though it had no heartbeat. She wanted to be with him. To hold him. To tell him he didn't have to carry it all alone. The discomfort never left Alice, not even when the sun began to rise over Seattle, painting the sky with pale orange hues. The dawn's light seemed unable to dispel the shadow lodged within her. Her family tried to mask their growing concern, exchanging barely perceptible glances and measured words, but everyone knew something was wrong. They assumed her worry came from Nate's pain, from the recent loss of his grandmother, the sweet Mrs. Winter, and believed he was surely devastated or, at least, needed a few days to disconnect and recover. Carlyle, as always, calm and steady, approached her with a soft voice meant to soothe, like a breeze trying to calm a storm. You must focus on the visions, Alice. On finding Victoria before it's too late, he said gently, his deep eyes full of ancient wisdom. Once we catch her, Bella and Nate will be safe. Alice nodded silently, unable to hide the hollow feeling eating away at her soul. Because that wasn't the true reason for her anguish. Not entirely. What kept her on the verge of collapse had nothing to do with Victoria. She hadn't told her family anything about the werewolf or the Romanions. Nate had asked her expressly. It was a secret they had to keep for the moment, at least until he thought it necessary to reveal it. Alice agreed, aware it was the only way to protect her family. If any of them fell into the hands of the Volturi, if Arrow tried to read their minds, at least as long as it wasn't her or Nate, the truth would remain hidden. But keeping it silent hurt. It hurt like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. After a few hours, later than expected, the last members they were waiting for finally arrived to close the situation. The arrival of the Denali clan filled the hotel with a different air. Tanya, Kate, Irina, Eleazar, Carmen, and Laurent as well. They all showed a determined attitude, ready to face the problem with the same seriousness and focus as the Cullens. Alice greeted them in the lobby with a hurried hug, though her mind remained torn between the familiar faces before her and the heavy shadow cast by Nate's absence. Laurent was the only one who lingered a bit longer with her. His eyes, though respectful, scrutinized her with an unease he couldn't hide. "Isn't Nathaniel here?" he asked quietly, almost as if he already knew the answer would displease him. Alice held his gaze firmly. She couldn't fully lie to him, but she couldn't betray the promise she had made either. "No, he just suffered a loss, so he stayed in another city for now to be safe. As soon as we finish with the neophytes, I'll return to him immediately," she said with a steady tone, though her heart tightened under the weight of the half-truth. Laurent seemed to understand, but he couldn't hide the shadow of disappointment that clouded his face. He nodded silently and walked away, joining the rest of the group that was beginning to gather in the makeshift strategy room. With everyone present, they naturally sought Alice's counsel. She was the key to determining the right moment to strike. She settled into a chair, closed her eyes, and tried to clear her mind, though focusing was difficult. The image of Victoria kept shifting, as if sensing they were close. It confused her, a disturbing feeling that churned her stomach. She breathed deeply, digging her fingers into the armrests, forcing herself to go deeper into the vision. Finally, the image stabilized. "She's in a warehouse on the outskirts of Seattle," she murmured, slowly opening her eyes. Her voice sounded weak, as if it was hard to say those words, but firm. "It seems to be her base. She's restless, nervous, as if waiting for something." Carlyle exchanged glances with Jasper, their faces showed contained concern. "Probably because her army is starting to draw too much attention. The deaths are becoming visible," Carlyle said with a serious, measured tone, aware of the gravity of the situation. Jasper stepped forward, his face hardened by countless battles. "Then the best thing would be to attack them just before they go out to feed. They'll be more aggressive, yes, but that ferocity will be their weak point. It will blind them," he explained confidently, showing trust in the strategy. Alice nodded slowly, accepting the reality of the plan that had to be carried out. "They'll hunt tomorrow night," she added in a low voice, almost a whisper. Everyone was silent for a moment, processing the information. Tanya, with a serious expression and arms crossed, was the first to speak. "Then we attack tomorrow." "Yes," Carlyle confirmed, looking at each person with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Prepare everything. Tomorrow night, it all ends." Alice nodded with the others, but inside she felt restless, dissatisfied. She wanted it all to be over already, wanted to be far away. She wanted to return to Nate. Every minute away from him was a constant pang in her chest, a reminder of what she had left behind. But for now, she had to do her part. She locked that pain inside her chest and forced herself to move forward. She stepped away a few paces from the group who were exchanging words until she felt a hand gently rest on her shoulder. Irina, who had just been with the group, approached her with a sweet and understanding expression. "They told me about you and Edward's partners. For me, this whole partners thing is new too, but I'm sure you're worried about him, right?" Alice looked at her, speechless. She couldn't answer, but her silence was enough to express everything she felt. Irina took her hand softly, conveying a comforting warmth. "He'll be okay. You'll be back with him soon," she said with a kind smile, empathizing with her old friend. Alice barely managed to nod, unable to form a word. They let the hours pass until the morning of the third day in Seattle arrived. The atmosphere was heavy with palpable, almost electric tension. Each person present fine-tuned mental and physical details, as if the weight of the imminent battle was felt in every held breath. Jasper took charge of giving the last strategic advice he could think of to face the neophytes, insisting they remember their lack of control, their brutal savagery without technique, and how that could be used to their advantage. His voice was firm, authoritative, but with a shade of concern he couldn't hide. Alice, however, felt increasingly detached from it all. The distance separating her from Nate weighed on her like an invisible slab, and frustration clouded her mind. She still hadn't heard from him. Not a call, not a message. Nothing. The void of his silence slowly consumed her. At one point, unable to contain her anxiety any longer, she walked over to where Carlyle was. His brow was furrowed, and his eyes, darker than usual, reflected a mixture of frustration and restrained desperation. I can't take it anymore. I'm going to DC to look for him, she said firmly, though trembling inside. Carlyle, unaware of the true weight behind those words, tried to calm her with his steady, serene tone. Alice, just a little longer. We're almost done. You're key to making sure Victoria doesn't escape. If she gets away now, all this will have been for nothing. As soon as this is over, I'll personally accompany you to find him, I promise. He paused for a moment and added with a slight smile. In knowing Nate, I don't think he's in danger. He's an extraordinary human. Always has been. I'm sure he just wants to be alone for a few days to process his loss. Alice pressed her lips tightly. She wanted to argue, tell him about the Romanions, about the wolf, about what Nate had told her, but she knew she couldn't betray his trust. She simply nodded, jaw clenched, and anguish on the verge of exploding. When the time was approaching, everyone prepared to head to Victoria's refuge. The atmosphere was dense, filled with expectant silence. Before moving, all eyes turned to Alice, waiting to see if one last vision would appear that might alter the course of the attack. Alice closed her eyes, trying to find her, to locate her silhouette among the broken threads of the future. She wanted to focus on Victoria, on her surroundings, on the terrain, but her mind inevitably wandered. She thought of Nate. His voice. His expression as he said goodbye. And then, she saw him. The vision, like all she had had of Nate, changed at a dizzying speed, but this time there was something different. The ending remained still, fixed, as if it were an unchangeable fact. Nate stood, his back turned to her. In front of him, Victoria, baring her fangs, was ready to pounce. And behind her, more than 20 vampires. All with glowing eyes, fierce, and looking at Nate with deadly determination to end his life. The atmosphere of the vision was thick, as if it were a trial. A condemnation. Alice remained motionless. Cold ran through her from her fingers to her chest, where even her dead heart seemed to shudder. It wasn't just a vision. It was a nightmare, which, although it had not yet happened, was already beginning to consume her from within. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 112. Nate, Pav. The pain didn't come like a blow, it came like an implosion. As if something inside his chest had suddenly collapsed, tearing away his flesh, his soul, his nerves from within. It wasn't fire. It wasn't burning. It was a conscious decomposition. A fracture of everything he was. Nate screamed. He knew he was screaming. He could feel his throat tearing with each howl, but he couldn't hear himself. He heard nothing. Only a deep, dense hum, like the muffled roar of the universe devouring itself. The world became distant, a formless echo, as if he'd been submerged in dirty, thick water, where only the echo of his breaking mind remained. He didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds, hours, centuries. The notion of time had become absurd. As if each millisecond stretched into eternity. As if the pain had no beginning or end, only an eternal present. At times, he thought he was dead. That this wasn't a transformation, but hell. A meticulous punishment for every mistake, every broken promise, every shadow he'd left behind. The pain was too vast to fit inside his body. He felt his skin dissolving, his bones shattering one by one with unbearable cracks, his blood boiling with acid. Everything contracted and expanded at once, as if something were molding him from within, as if his flesh were rebelling. And then, in the middle of the darkness, a spasm shook him. His back arched uncontrollably, fingers curled at impossible angles. In those moments, he could barely open his eyes, not by will, but by reflex. And what he saw made no sense. Sometimes the sky loomed above him, stained a sickly blue, without warmth, without life. Sometimes it was all night. A thick, humid darkness with no stars, only the echo of whispering voices speaking things he couldn't understand. And other times, he saw them. The Romanions. Stefan. Vladimir. Motionless, their sharp faces and calm smiles frozen in place. As if they were watching a ceremony. As if what he endured was a work of art, and they were the only spectators. And he screamed. He screamed from a throat that no longer felt like his. His body convulsed uncontrollably, as if every cell was rebelling, as if he was being torn apart to build something new in his place. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't die. only exist within that cycle of destruction. Time unraveled. There was no up or down, no ground, no sky. No body. No air. Only pain remained. Until, at some moment, he couldn't place, something changed. The pain didn't vanish. But it became different. No longer a constant bonfire, but burning embers beneath his skin. A strange stillness arrived, as if he'd been plunged into snow after burning alive. As if the most fragile part of him, the human part, the weak part, had been extinguished. And what remained, was something new. He couldn't move. His body felt like someone else's shell. Each muscle felt light years away, his consciousness trapped inside something that didn't respond. Like sleep paralysis, but deeper. More absolute. And then, he heard voices. At first distant, then too clear. Voices from everywhere at once. Conversations of people crossing a street. The crunch of a rat in the trash. The scrape of a leaf dragged by the wind. Stefan and Vladimir are murmuring, laughing. Everything entered his mind as if there were no filters. As if the entire world were speaking directly into his skull. And in that frozen stillness, his mind ignited. But no longer from pain. From memory. He thought of his grandmother. Her tired voice. The texture of her old hands stroking his hair. She always seemed to have a sarcastic comment at the tip of her tongue. He thought of his parents. Of what they never said. Of the void they left behind. Of the words he had never heard, and that still haunted him. And he thought of Alice. Her face emerged in the chaos. Like a beacon. Like an apparition. Her smile. Her worried gaze. The way she walked was like she floated. Her sadness. Her fear. Her strength. And the thought was clear. A whisper amid the wreckage. All of this pain will be worth it, if it gives me the power to protect her. If I never have to see her afraid again. If I can be something more than a victim of fate. And then, he felt something. A tremor. A quake beneath the skin, like his body reigniting from within. A first shiver. His fingers twitched, clumsy, like waking after centuries of sleep. He began to feel everything around him with more clarity. And in a slow, heavy, definitive gesture. He opened his eyes. The first thing Nate saw was an unfamiliar ceiling. Cracked, dusty, covered in trembling shadows and tiny insects moving with almost unreal slowness, as if time itself had slowed down. He blinked once, not quite understanding what he was seeing. Everything moved in slow motion. The world, suddenly, was something else. The sound had changed, too. No longer noise, it was texture. He could hear the wind slipping between dry leaves outside, every friction, every creak, every brush of the branches. He could hear the rhythmic tapping of a single fingernail against a wooden table, like a metronome marking his return to life. He inhaled. Not because he needed to, but out of instinct, out of curiosity. And the air offered him an entire universe. He smelled the aged trash in the area, dense and sour. Other aromas too, sweeter yet strangely fermented, like forgotten fruit in a basement. He noticed animals. Rodents, raccoons perhaps, small living bodies that smelled of dirt, rotten leaves, wet roots. His nose, once only capable of the basics, now dissected the environment as if the air were made of layers he could peel away one by one. He tried to sit up slowly, or so he thought. But when he noticed, he was already standing. He didn't know how. There had been no effort. No transition. Just a thought, and the result. He looked down at his body. He wore the same clothes he'd fallen into that hell with, torn, dirty, slashed in several places. Through the rips, he saw his skin, pale. Paler than ever. He turned his head toward a broken window on the other side of the room. A direct sunbeam cut through the dimness with almost theatrical intensity. He wanted to move slowly, to test his new body, but his legs had already taken him there. Just 2 steps. Or less. Each movement was a leap. From 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. And then, the sunlight touched him. Nate closed his eyes. The sunlight caressed his face like a warm breeze. It didn't burn. It didn't scorch. It didn't repel him. It was different. As if the sun now recognized him, as if his new condition wasn't a curse, but an ascension. He felt the light wrap around his skin with unexpected reverence, sparking a glow, almost mineral-like, like he was made of quartz or polished marble. Every pore radiated a glow, luminous and undeniably unnatural. But the physical was only the surface. The truly overwhelming part came from within. His mind, already sharp, analytical, structured, was now flooded with clarity. Thinking required no effort. Ideas connected with surgical precision, memories emerged with details once irrelevant and now full of hidden patterns. He could break down complex thoughts in fractions of a second, anticipate outcomes, and simulate scenarios. His awareness moved in multiple layers at once, no noise, no fatigue. And yet, the most astonishing part was the contrast. He remembered what it felt like to be human. He remembered how slow thought was, how dull. The numbed senses, the body limited by exhaustion, hunger, and fear. He remembered struggling through the fog of fatigue to finish a thought, a conversation, a simple decision. Now, in contrast, every thought was crystalline. As if his brain, his essence, had been refined, tempered, perfected. Nate didn't need to open his eyes to know what surrounded him or how many seconds had passed since the light had entered through the window. He felt elated. He had crossed a threshold. And everything he was, the good, the dark, the terrible, and the brilliant, was now at full capacity, pulsing beneath his new skin. He smiled. The silence was interrupted by soft movements on the other side of the wall. Nate didn't need to open his eyes to know that Vladimir and Stefan were in the next room. Since waking, he had been aware of them, of every tiny movement, though they emitted no human sounds, no breathing, no heartbeat. They entered with slow, measured steps. To Nate, it was like hearing water fall in slow motion. Every step on the old wood creaked just barely, but his mind registered it like a scream. He felt them open the door, felt their figures pause for a moment in the doorway, watching him. Vladimir spoke first. How does immortality feel, Nathaniel? Nate opened his eyes slowly. He observed them carefully. Since he'd met the Romanions, he had noticed something in them. They always looked at him with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if they existed on a higher plane. But now their postures were cautious. Their bodies stayed near the door, hands relaxed but ready, as if they expected something in Nate to explode. As if they were no longer so sure what he was. Nate noticed. He felt the impulse to approach suddenly, just to see if they'd flinch. But he restrained himself. It wasn't time to play. It feels excellent, he finally said, opening his eyes a little wider. His voice sounded different. Similar, yes, but with a new texture. Velvety, smooth, almost seductive without trying. A voice made to be listened to. The Romanians finally stepped in, slowly, still measuring every movement. Where are we? Nate asked, voice dry. Vladimir and Stefan exchanged a glance. A brief, silent exchange heavy with a message Nate instantly caught. We're just outside Seattle, Stefan replied. We brought you here to fulfill your purpose, Vladimir added. Nate nodded, satisfied. He had always known the Romanians were trying to manipulate him. They did it elegantly, without direct lies, but with carefully managed truths. Even so, he appreciated that they kept their word. They helped him. They delivered. For now, that was enough. He stood still for a few seconds. Completely motionless, like a statue carved from marble, his gaze fixed on a spot on the worn-out floor. Without turning to face them, he asked in a dry voice. How long has it been since I was bitten? The silence lasted only a moment before Stefan replied, his tone relaxed, almost mocking. This is the second day. I must admit, your transformation was faster than we expected. Nate opened his mouth slightly to respond, but instead, a wave of fire surged up his throat. It was sudden, searing. He brought a hand to his neck, fingers pressing against his skin as if that could ease the internal burn. He closed his eyes for a second. The burn was intense, primitive. It wasn't pain, it was hunger. Thirst. Stefan let out a short laugh. That's normal. Your body is asking for it, you need blood. Nate frowned and walked toward one of the dirty, half-open windows. His eyes scanned the dense vegetation surrounding the house, his amplified senses detecting subtle signs of life. The scrape of a squirrel on bark, the flap of wings, the distant breathing of a deer. Everything came to him in perfect detail. There are animals nearby, he murmured. The Romanian stepped closer, almost paternally. Stefan reached out as if to touch his shoulder, but Nate turned swiftly, locking eyes with him. His eyes looked like molten glass, dangerous. Stefan's fingers froze mid-air, then slowly retracted. That won't be necessary, Nathaniel, said Vladimir, crossing his arms. Stefan disappeared through the hallway door. A second later, he returned carrying a white hospital cooler. Nate didn't need it open to know what was inside. The scent hit him like a wave. Sweet. Metallic. Exquisitely alive. It was intoxicating. His nostrils flared. His whole body reacted. When they opened the cooler, several medical blood bags lay inside. Nate lunged at them with a hunger he couldn't control. He tore open the first one with his teeth and emptied it into his mouth immediately. The liquid coursed through him like an electric shock, reconnecting every cell, calming the fire in his throat. The Romanians watched in silence for a few seconds, then chuckled lowly. This is the good part, Nathaniel. We'd heard about Carlyle's peculiar diet, Vladimir said with a half smile. But we thought it best you try human blood first. Nate barely heard them. He already had another bag in his hands, tearing it clumsily and pouring it straight into his mouth. Just wait until you try it fresh, straight from a person, Stefan added, amused. The taste is incomparable. But Nate didn't answer. He wasn't interested in their morbid commentary, only in the relief. When he finished the last bag, his movements grew slower, more precise. He blinked. He felt sharp again, focused. In those brief moments while feeding, he could feel his mind going dark. He wiped his mouth with his forearm and looked at them intensely. The Romanians exchanged a satisfied, conspiratorial glance. Now that you're complete, we want to see what you're capable of. We've been doing some research. We think we found your target. Nate raised his chin. He didn't need to ask who they meant. He knew instantly. He nodded, gaze fierce, tense, focused like the tip of a spear. A surge of anticipation ran through his body. He wanted to know what he was capable of now, too. And there was no better test than Victoria. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 113. The Romanians insisted they wait until sunset. When the sun begins to fall, said Vladimir in a low but firm voice, that will be the ideal time to attack. The less light there is, the less attention we draw. Stefan brought him a change of clothes, carefully folded over a tattered armchair in the corner of the room. Your clothes are destroyed. These will fit better. Nate examined the garments. Dark pants, a black soft fabric shirt, a thick jacket, and worn but sturdy boots. All in muted, almost military tones. He put them on without a word, noticing they were very similar to what the Romanians wore. An unofficial uniform. But he said nothing. I need to move a bit, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Being cooped up is suffocating. I'll go out to the nearby forest. The Romanians exchanged a brief glance. We'll come with you, said Stefan. It wasn't a suggestion. Nate didn't protest. He left the house, pushing the door with an effortless motion. The place they had been staying in was barely a structure anymore, old wood, peeled by dampness, lost among twisted trees and wild vegetation. There were other similar constructions a few meters away, equally abandoned, equally sad, like skeletons forgotten by the modern world. The wind carried new scents. People. Humans walking distant trails, perhaps a lost hiker, maybe someone camping in the woods. They smelled intensely. Sweet. Warm. Tempting. Nate couldn't help but close his eyes and inhale deeply. The blood he had drunk wasn't enough to quench that burning, almost animal desire that ignited every time the scent of humans reached him. Vladimir noticed the gesture and smiled, tilting his head slightly. Smells good, doesn't it? He murmured with a dark amusement in his voice. That's how it begins for all of us. Stefan stepped closer, as if he meant to say something more. But Nate turned sharply, his body tense like a coiled spring. His gaze was hard, determined. No, he said coldly. And then he ran. The speed with which he moved was inhuman. A dark blur among the trees, a whisper through the grass, a shadow the wind barely caught. The Romanians didn't follow immediately. They shared a quick look, recognizing something between them that needed no words. Then, without a command, they sprinted after him. Their movements were equally silent, equally lethal. Nate, for his part, had no clear destination. He only knew he needed to run. To test his body, stretch his senses, learn the limits of his new existence. He moved deeper into the forest with firm steps, making sure he went far enough to be out of sight. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. There were no trails or signs of civilization. Only ancient trees, standing like forgotten columns, completely surrounded him. Once he felt it was safe, he finally stopped. He studied his surroundings with a mixture of focus and fascination. The stillness of the forest had something sacred about it, as if it breathed with him. Seconds later, the Romanians emerged from the shadows, keeping their distance. Vladimir and Stefan simply watched him without a word, their faces unreadable. Nate removed the dark jacket they had given him and let it fall carelessly to the ground. His arms, marked with stone-like muscle, tensed as he flexed. He walked toward the nearest tree, examined it for a second, and then struck it. The trunk exploded with a dull crack, splinters and bark flying in all directions before collapsing with a crash. Without pause, Nate pivoted and delivered a brutal kick to another nearby tree, toppling it just as easily. He breathed deeply, but wasn't winded. Each impact drew a smile to his face, satisfaction, even euphoria. He struck more trees, rocks, and even hardened patches of earth. He didn't do it just to destroy. He did it to feel. To test himself. Vladimir and Stefan exchanged a brief look. There was no surprise on their faces, only a measured silence. They were evaluating him. Eventually, Nate stood amid the wreckage of his brief rampage. He turned to face them, his eyes still alight with excitement. I'm tired of hitting things that don't hit back, he said, his voice deep. Come on, Vladimir. Test me. The Romanian remained still for a few seconds, as if weighing the risks. Then he stepped forward, his expression unchanged. He walked until he stood just a couple of meters from Nate. That's when Nate noticed the size difference. The Romanians were strong, yes, but small in comparison. Where he was an imposing statue carved from marble, they were agile shadows honed by centuries. Tension settled over the clearing like a brewing storm. There would be no unnecessary words. Only the brutal language of bodies. Vladimir was the first to move. No hesitation, just a firm gaze toward Nate and a subtle nod. He took a position, feet apart, body low, arms extended, ready to strike. His movements were clean, precise, almost elegant. He glided over the earth like a shadow trained for decades. And without warning, he launched the first blow. It was direct, sharp, palm extended, aiming like a spear at Nate's chest. Nate didn't move. He observed the attack with unsettling calm, eyes following the motion before it even landed. With a simple twist of his wrist, he deflected it effortlessly. Vladimir didn't stop. He chained a series of rapid strikes, almost invisible to the human eye. Each aimed at vital points: neck, ribs, jaw, and solar plexus. But to Nate, it was like watching a poorly rehearsed dance. His body reacted on its own, his mind barely needed to process it. Every strike was anticipated, blocked, and diverted with the ease of someone who didn't need to think to win. Vladimir's style was fast, lethal. He struck with his palms like each blow was a dagger. But Nate realized something alarming. Not only could he keep up, he could see everything coming. It was as if Vladimir's body screamed his intentions before he acted. For several seconds, Nate remained defensive, analyzing. The ground cracked underfoot, and leaves flew with every dodged blow. He could have ended the fight at any moment. He could have brought him down from the first exchange. But he didn't, not out of arrogance. He did it to understand. To confirm he was on another level. Vladimir spun, aiming for Nate's neck. Nate took a single step back, tilting his head just centimeters, letting the strike pass through the air. Then he feigned a mistake. Over-rotated his torso while blocking, as if he'd lost balance. Vladimir saw it immediately and smiled. He lunged with renewed speed, thinking he'd found a real opening. That's when Nate moved. With a full-body pivot, he redirected Vladimir's charge and, in the same motion, grabbed the back of his neck with one hand. The impact was brutal. He slammed him into the ground with a force that shook the earth. A dull thud echoed through the trees. Vladimir was pinned, face to the ground, body immobilized. He kicked, struggled, and tried to break free with strength and technique. It was useless. It was like a mountain had fallen on him. Stefan, who had been watching with inhuman stillness, took a step forward. His eyes, until then cold, flickered with a spark of doubt, maybe concern. Instinct told him to intervene. But just as his foot moved across the dirt, Nate looked at him. He didn't speak. He just smiled. A calm smile, without mockery or cruelty, but filled with power. Then, just as effortlessly as he'd pinned him, he let Vladimir go. He rolled to the side, gasping, his pride more shattered than his body. Silence fell over the clearing, thick as invisible fog. Nate stood calmly, brushing the dirt from his hands. And for a few seconds, neither Romanian dared to move. Nate smiled, satisfied with the feeling of his enhanced physical abilities. Even in his human days, no one had ever bested him in fair combat. Now, as a vampire, it all felt almost ridiculous. He took a few steps back, assessing his opponent's condition. Vladimir was already standing, his expression hardened by humiliation. There was something almost tragic in his eyes, as if centuries of experience and martial refinement had vanished in a single moment. Now both of you, said Nate with a rough voice, no trace of politeness. The Romanians exchanged a look that sparked with restrained excitement. Stefan was the first to speak, still smiling. You're being a little arrogant, Nathaniel. Vladimir completed the sentence with a predator's grin. But we'll give you the pleasure of knowing defeat. They became a blur, attacking with a synchronicity honed over time, one from the left and the other from the right. But Nate moved faster. Instead of retreating, he advanced, intercepting the first strike with his forearm and landing a crushing blow to Vladimir's chest that launched him several meters back into a thick oak. The wood splintered. Vladimir rolled, then got up almost instantly. Stefan came from behind, but Nate spun on one foot and grabbed his arm, flipping him over the shoulder as if his body weighed nothing. The crash shook the ground, dust rising around them. The forest trembled with each clash. No blood. Only hardened bones and ancient structures collide with supernatural violence. Every blow Nate landed left small, visible cracks on the Romanians' skin. Their inert flesh cracked like porcelain under that brutal force. Vladimir, back on his feet, charged with a war cry, but Nate intercepted him with a kick to the stomach that lifted him off the ground, sending him crashing into a moss-covered rock that split in two. Stefan didn't stop. He dropped from the branches with a dive attack, aiming to crack Nate's skull, but Nate turned just in time, raised an arm to block, grabbed him by the throat, lifted him, and hurled him into a tree trunk meters away. The impact left a dent. For a moment, everything was still, save for the faint rustle of leaves. Then both Romanians rose at once, clothes torn, bodies cracked, but eyes ablaze. They didn't look angry. On the contrary, they looked thrilled, like predators finally finding someone who could hunt them back. Without a word, they spread out, circling Nate. Each took a side, forming a deadly angle. Without warning, they attacked at once, like twin blades aiming to slice him in two. Nate didn't move until the last second. When they were close enough, he stretched his arms and grabbed both by the head, one in each hand. Using his own axis as leverage, he spun and smashed them into the ground, creating a crater on either side of his body. The sound was brutal, a dull echo lost in the trees. But there were no screams. Only laughter. First from Stefan, who, even with his cheek pressed against the ground, let out a deep, almost incredulous laugh. I knew it, he exclaimed between laughs. You're a complete monster, Nathaniel. Vladimir was the first to stand, shaking dirt from his hair. A visible crack ran down his left cheek, but he smiled with a savage expression. No one has ever defeated us that easily. You truly are worthy to be our champion. Nate watched them, brow slightly furrowed. He wasn't tired. Not even winded. Just focused. He walked steadily back to where he had left his jacket. The crunch of leaves under his boots was the only sound breaking the forest's heavy silence. He bent down, picked up the jacket, and put it on again, brushing dry dirt from the sleeves. He buttoned the collar slowly, as if the recent brutality hadn't affected him at all. That's enough, he said in a deep voice, without looking at them. The Romanians had risen again, their bodies already free of the cracks Nate had inflicted, as if the flesh quietly reordered itself. But their expressions had changed. No more mockery or arrogance, only silent respect and a flicker of contained euphoria. Now take me to Victoria, Nate ordered. His voice was sharp, cold, iron. The thrill of his new power dissolved like smoke inside him, replaced by something more urgent, more visceral, the image of Alice in danger. Stefan stepped forward, raising his hands in a conciliatory gesture. We already told you, it's better to wait until the sun starts to fall. We'll draw less attention than Wah. Nate interrupted him without words. Just a look. His eyes were burning coals. Red, heavy, irrevocable. The threat wasn't spoken, but it felt like a blade gently resting on the throat. Stefan froze. For a second, he even seemed to swallow, an almost useless act for someone like him. Vladimir, with a half smile, turned to his companion. They exchanged a wordless glance, like soldiers sharing a joke before heading into battle. As you wish, Nathaniel, he finally said, with a trace of dark amusement. At the very least, it will be a spectacle worth watching. Nate didn't respond. He was already moving between the trees. His steps weren't rushed, but each carried the urgency of a countdown. The forest stillness seemed to part before him, reverent, as if nature itself sensed that something dark was being unleashed. The two vampires followed without another word, slipping between the trunks like ancient shadows, eager to witness the fury of their creation. Chapter 114. The trees seemed to glide by on either side like liquid shadows as the three vampires moved through the forest at impossible speeds. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the occasional crunch of branches underfoot and the soft whisper of the wind through the pines. Sunlight had begun to filter through the tall canopy, casting golden beams that forced them to stay within heavily shaded areas, always careful to avoid human eyes. Vladimir, leading the way, turned his face slightly toward Nate. We're following the trail of several newborns, he reported in a deep voice, never slowing. It ends at an old factory, south of here, near the outskirts of Seattle. Stefan, bringing up the rear, added calmly. The wisest move is to circle around the forest perimeter. A direct path would put us under the sun and near areas frequented by humans. We can't risk being seen. Nate didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed ahead, though his mind was moving faster than his body. If the newborns were all in one place, and the Cullens hadn't intervened yet. Have you seen the Cullen group? He asked suddenly, without turning. Vladimir let out a short, dry laugh. Yes. There are a lot of them. They're gathered in the center of the city, like they're waiting for something. Nate frowned, slowing slightly to come up beside Vladimir. Waiting. Why haven't they attacked yet? It's been 2 days. He said no more. The reason didn't matter as much as the outcome. If they hadn't moved yet, he still had time. He felt grateful for that unexpected window. An opportunity. Alice was still safe. Stefan, curious, spoke from behind. Are you going to join them? Fight together against the newborns? No, Nate replied firmly, without hesitation. I want to keep my mate as far away from that fight as possible. His voice wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. He stopped abruptly, turning his face toward Stefan. You go. Keep the Cullens occupied. Lead them in the opposite direction if you can. I'll only need a few hours. For a second, Stefan stared at him without replying. After centuries of volatile alliances, no one spoke to him in commanding tones, especially not someone so young. But if it bothered him, he didn't show it. He simply inclined his head. As you wish, Nathaniel. Vladimir, on the other hand, smiled with that ancient, wild glint in his eyes. A newborn army, just you and me. Sounds like a good challenge, he said almost eagerly, like he could already taste the battle. Nate only nodded and resumed the march. A few seconds later, the group split. Stefan took a detour toward the city, vanishing into the forest shadows in flawless silence. Vladimir, needing no further words, continued leading Nate along the hidden path toward the abandoned factory. The terrain began to shift as they neared the city's outskirts. The trees, though still dense, gave way to clearings where the vegetation was lower, and the ground turned to loose earth, tangled with weeds and exposed roots. The distant hum of moving cars could be heard, blending with the sharp whistle of birds sensing their presence. Vladimir slowed slightly, raising a hand. Nate mimicked the gesture, stopping beside him atop a moss-covered hill. From there, they could partially see through the tree line. A gray, rusted structure emerged from the foliage like an industrial corpse. The abandoned factory was a cracked concrete block, with collapsed roofs in places and shattered windows like empty sockets. Machinery remnants jutted out from rust and grime, slowly being devoured by invasive vegetation. There it is, Vladimir murmured, nodding his chin. His voice was barely audible, but thick with anticipation. The scent of newborns is everywhere. They haven't learned to mask their trail. Nate sharpened his senses. The air was thick with a mix of smells, damp earth, old metal, and yes, the rough, unstable scent of several young vampires. Easy to recognize, because he still carried it himself. How many? Nate asked, eyes still on the building. About 30, maybe fewer. The stench changes. They move a lot. When I came yesterday, I even saw a few killing each other. And Victoria. The only one who's not a newborn, Vladimir replied. She seems alert. When we got close to Scout, she nearly caught us, but we backed off quickly. A tense silence settled between them. Nate looked down, gauging the distance between them and the building. He knew what needed to be done. He couldn't leave loose ends. This time, he would be decisive. I'm going in, he said without hesitation. I want you to wait outside and, if she tries to escape, contain her as much as you can. Vladimir glanced sideways at him, his lips curling into a slight smile. Planning to put on a show. Nate remained silent, his mind processing his next moves. Vladimir let out a hoarse chuckle, older than any human sound. If you can, leave a few alive. They might be useful. Nate didn't wait any longer. In a blink, he descended the hill with smooth, precise movements, like a predator locked onto its prey. He left no trace, no sound. Only the distant crunch of underbrush bending under his swift steps. As he neared the factory's perimeter, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, almost electric. Not with fear. Not yet. But with tension. There was movement inside, low voices, occasional thuds that made the walls tremble, footsteps echoing like phantom beats through the concrete corridors. Newborns. Undisciplined. Too noisy for their own good. Nate stopped next to an exterior wall, placing one hand on the cold concrete. He inhaled deeply and, with a sharp push, knocked down an entire section of the wall. The impact echoed through the building. Chunks of brick and metal flew in all directions as dust rose like thick fog. All eyes turned to him. Dozens of red irises locked on the lone figure emerging from the rubble. The tension was palpable. Many sniffed the air anxiously, confused. Nate didn't smell quite like them, even with the newborn stench. There was something more, something dominant, feral. Something none of them could immediately identify. His eyes scanned the room with glacial calm. He counted precisely 27 newborns. None seemed older than 23 when they were turned. Some argued like disoriented wolves, others cowered in corners, trembling, eyes darting. A few clustered in unsure groups of 4 or 5. The atmosphere was chaotic, fragile, a brittle equilibrium on the verge of collapse. On the second floor of the factory, leaning over a rusted railing, was Victoria. She watched from above with a curious expression. She didn't remember turning the vampire who'd just arrived, though his face felt vaguely familiar. She'd bitten so many insignificant humans that she could barely recall them anymore. But she couldn't help but notice that this newcomer carried a presence far more imposing than Riley's. But Nate didn't look at her yet. He was measuring the room like a hunter before the pounce. Then, one of the newborns decided to approach. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a crooked grin on his face. He walked over with a swagger, assuming this was just another recruit needing to learn his place. Without asking, he reached out and clamped a firm hand on Nate's shoulder, trying to assert dominance. Fatal mistake. Nate turned in a single motion, fast as lightning. His arms moved with surgical precision and, before the newborn could react, Nate's hands clamped brutally around his head. With one sharp twist, he snapped it with devastating force. The crack echoed through the factory like a gunshot. Without missing a beat, Nate tore the head from the body in one clean motion. The torso hit the ground with a hollow thud. The head rolled a few feet and stopped next to a chunk of debris. Absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. And through the hanging dust, Nate slowly looked up. The newborns remained frozen. Not a single one dared to move. The silence after the killing was thick, like hot ash clinging to the throat. Some exchanged quick, nervous glances. The vampire Nate had just killed wasn't just anyone. Rumor had it that, if Riley hadn't been Victoria's chosen one, he would have been her right hand. He had his own circle, 4 newborns who followed him like starving dogs begging for scraps of power. Now, those 4 stared at the body. Or what remained of it. Head and body, discarded like garbage. Their faces showed a mix of rage and fear, but none stepped forward. No one dared. Nate didn't move. He glanced down at the severed head as if evaluating something, searching for an emotion that never came. He felt no guilt. Not even a hint of remorse. Only a bitter disappointment sank into his gut like molten lead. A part of him asked cruelly. What if I kill them all? What if I set them on fire and let their ashes fill this foul air? Maybe, in the middle of that blaze, the fury would finally subside. Maybe, at last, there would be silence. He raised his gaze slowly. And then he saw her. Victoria. To Nate, she was a shadow. A dark blot in his memory. A creature that had taken so much from him, he could never reclaim. But unfortunately for her, she had also taken his fear. Because Nate no longer feared Victoria. Nor the newborns. Nor anyone who dared approach him with bared fangs. Seeing her there, so calm, so sure of herself, stirred something else. Not rage. Something darker. Deeper. He wanted her to suffer. He wanted her to feel something close to what he had felt. To scream. To beg. But his face didn't change. His body stood tall, unmoving, like a marble statue among the ruins. Then, without stepping forward, eyes fixed on Victoria and now 26 pairs of crimson eyes on him. He opened his mouth to speak. His voice emerged like black silk, melodic, deep, carefully modulated to capture attention, but cold enough to seep under the skin like ice water. I don't know what they told you after they took your humanity. But there's one thing you all need to understand. The newborns couldn't help but feel intimidated. His presence was overwhelming. Something about him felt like the edge of an abyss. It seemed that if you blinked, if you lost sight of him for even a second, the next thing you'd see would be your own death. Nate, unaware, or indifferent, to their thoughts, continued, giving them no time to respond. Every one of you here is going to die. The spell broke. Several stepped back, as if pushed by an invisible force. A tense murmur rose, barely audible under whispers of panic. Victoria and Riley were right. They sent him to kill us, the golden-eyed ones sent him. Nate didn't interrupt. He let them talk. Let them swallow their fear. He listened. Measured. And then he took a single step forward. Absolute silence. All eyes, like threads of fire, locked on him again. Even the loudest fell quiet. There was no doubt, whoever this intruder was, he had just claimed the center of their world, and did so as if it already belonged to him. Nate spoke again, every word carved with purpose. But I'm here to give you a chance. His gaze swept across the room, meeting their eyes, one by one. Victoria can't protect you. She can't lead you. She can't even face me. Some newborns frowned. Rage boiled in their veins. They saw him as a blasphemer. But others hesitated. They hesitated because survival instinct still flickered within them. And that instinct told them that, whatever Nate was, he wasn't a normal vampire. Not even Riley could have killed like that. So clean. So simple. I can lead you, Nate continued firmly. And I'm offering you something you won't get twice. His voice hardened like forged steel. A chance. He said it without moving a muscle, without raising his voice. He didn't need to. Anyone who bows their head will walk out of here alive. Chapter 115. From the second floor railing, Victoria watched the tension grow like an uncontrollable fire. Below, the neophytes gathered like a restless herd, exchanging looks heavy with suspicion. Nate's scent unsettled them. He lacked the weather density of an ancient vampire. He did not carry the echo of centuries like she did. No. He smelled fresh, too fresh. Even fresher than they did. And yet, his posture, the steady gaze, the dangerous calm with which he held the silence, conveyed something none of them could name. A couple of neophytes began to bow slightly, as if a primitive instinct compelled them to recognize him as more than just an equal. Victoria jumped down. The impact was sharp, elegant, and threatening. She landed in front of them with feline precision, and those closest instinctively stepped back. Enough. Her voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, silencing the collective murmur. She advanced with slow, calculated steps, like a predator closing the distance on its prey. Don't forget who brought you into this world, she said, poisoning every word with malice. I gave you strength, speed, the chance to stop being prey. And only I can teach you how to survive when those damned golden-eyed ones come to rip your heads off. The group hesitated, caught between instinct and obedience. Victoria fixed her gaze on Nate, raising an eyebrow with contempt. And you, a newborn, you think you can do better than me? What do you know about leadership, besides crawling around for a few hours like a puppy that still doesn't understand what it is? Nate didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He watched her calmly, and in that calm, he read something the others missed. She was pretending. Pretending to have more confidence than she really had. Her posture, the weight on her heels, the barely concealed tension in her shoulders, she was ready to flee as soon as she thought she'd lose the advantage. In his mind, possibilities flashed in the blink of an eye. Then, as if the idea had arrived on its own, he slowly moved a hand inside his jacket. From there, he pulled out a small object, worn by years, its bluish gleam dimming under the low light. A knife. Old, with a black handle, marked by prolonged use. Victoria looked at it, first without understanding, then the memory hit her like lightning. The ballet studio. The echo of footsteps on the wood. James, kneeling, the knife embedded in his forehead. The short-haired vampire, firm and lethal, was standing beside him. The human, curled in a corner, breathing as if every breath was the last. The Cullen James wanted to provoke, holding his head, and ripping it off with one clean move. And finally, a young man, sitting, chest heaving and hands trembling, but eyes fixed on the determination to kill. She never knew their names. But their faces, that scene, and that damned knife, had been burned into her memory like red-hot iron. It was you. Her voice broke, soaked in hatred. Fury struck her like a lightning bolt. Her fingers curled into claws, and every muscle in her body tensed, ready to launch. Nate narrowed his eyes. A brief surge of satisfaction ran through him, but his expression remained as unreadable as before. Victoria raised her hand abruptly, finger pointing straight at Nate, and her voice cracked like a whip through the air. Grab him. The roar was laced with rage, but also an urgency she couldn't hide. She wanted to be the one to tear his head off. To feel her hands tearing flesh and bone. To prove that fresh scent and that face that brought back unforgettable memories wouldn't survive her. The neophytes faltered. Some took a couple of steps forward, urged by the order, but their movements were clumsy, tentative. Others, the same who minutes before had felt the strange urge to bow before Nate, stepped back, instinct warning them not to get too close. The tension thickened like invisible smoke. On their faces, an internal war was visible. They knew the strength of their numbers could crush him, but they also knew that the first to approach could fall as easily as the neophyte Nate had killed a few minutes ago, without apparent effort. Nate stood still, watching patiently, as if he already knew how it would end. No one wanted to be first. No one wanted to bet their life on that show of loyalty. Victoria spun on her heels, looking at them one by one, and Nate didn't miss the flicker in her eyes. It was desperation. She hid it quickly, burying it under a wall of coldness, but he saw it. "Don't you hear me?" she repeated, her voice losing its edge, becoming sharper, more biting. The third shout came almost as a squeal, stripped of authority. "Grab him." This time, those who had stepped forward reacted as if pulled by an invisible rope. They lunged at Nate with violent momentum, breaking the air with the force of their leaps. And at that moment, Nate's calm broke just enough to give way to something more lethal. Several neophytes threw themselves at Nate at once, an uncontrolled tide of bodies and sharp fangs, ready to tear him apart without mercy. The air filled with the dull sound of hurried footsteps, sharp breaths, and fierce growls. Nate widened his eyes, locking a cold gaze on his attackers. A wild, primal spark ignited inside him, running through every muscle, tightening every fiber of his being. He lowered his center of gravity, planting his feet firmly against the rough concrete, feeling it vibrate under his weight. He waited. Calm. Certain. The first to launch himself was the fastest, a swift shadow aiming to knock him down with a brutal charge. Nate caught his wrists with lethal precision mid-leap. Not only did he block, but he used that momentum to spin himself like an unstoppable whirlwind, turning the neophyte into a living battering ram. He smashed him forcefully into advancing companions. The crash was brutal. Bodies collided, bones cracked, and several vampires flew across the dusty floor, thrown like rag dolls. Without missing a beat, Nate lifted the neophyte still in his hands. With a sharp, brutal move, he slammed him onto the floor, making the old factory vibrate like a giant drum. The agonizing scream barely began to escape his throat when Nate, without a hint of mercy, planted his boot firmly on the head and, with a dry, precise tug, ripped off both arms. The scream tore through the silence, echoing between rusty walls and decayed beams. But Nate showed no emotion, seeming more like he was tearing dead branches off a dry tree. The neophytes thrown violently to the ground scrambled up quickly, staggering and charging at him again with desperation and rage. Nate didn't hesitate. He leapt agilely to the metal railing where Victoria had been minutes before, feeling the metal vibrate beneath his feet. The roar of furious steps intensified behind him, closing in with deadly speed. One of them, claws extended and fangs bared, jumped decisively to grab him and sink its claws into his face. But Nate, recalling Vladimir's precise and lethal moves, opened his palm like a cutting blade and delivered a brutal swipe to the attacker's neck. The cut was clean and sure. The vampire's head rolled down the metal corridor, hit the railing with a dry sound, and fell into the void with a macabre echo. A flame of ferocity ignited in Nate's chest. Two more neophytes climbed the railing, one on each end, moving like furious lightning toward him. Nate turned his head, calculating in a fraction of a second who would arrive first. The one on the left was faster. Without hesitation, Nate met him with a brutal kick to the chest, the impact sending him flying back with immense force, crashing through a dusty window. The glass shattered into 1,000 crystalline fragments as the vampire's body disappeared outside with a sharp, resonant thud. The second barely had time to open his mouth and scream when Nate, spinning fluidly on his axis, landed a punch on his face. The blow stopped his advance immediately, fracturing bones and cutting the air violently. Before he could react, Nate grabbed him by the neck with a powerful, firm hand. He jumped off the railing with his body dangling, and mid-fall, with a quick twist and a dry crack that chilled the blood, ripped off the head with a brutal tug. The lifeless body hit the concrete floor with a dull sound, while Nate landed crouched, the enemy's head still firmly in his hand, like a dark trophy. With a careless motion, he threw the head toward Victoria. The lifeless body hit the ground with a dry sound, the head rolling to stop right in front of her. The open, empty eyes seemed to follow her, accusatory in their deadly silence. Victoria remained completely still, paralyzed by a terror that gripped her, as if an invisible ice froze her muscles and robbed her of the will to move or even breathe. A roar of rage broke the grave silence. Two neophytes, unable to contain their fury and desperation, launched themselves at Nate like a maddened pack, their bodies tense and fangs gleaming with violent thirst. Then, Nate growled. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to emerge from the very abyss of his soul, so charged with menace that the very air seemed to thicken around him. His lips slowly curled back, revealing his fangs, and his eyes flared with an incandescent red, more intense than fire, burning just by looking at them. He didn't take a step back. Firm, immovable, like a predator who knows no force in that place can overcome him. The neophytes arrived instantly, a whirlwind of blows, scratches, and bites launched in desperation. But Nate was a living steel wall. He moved his torso and head with surgical precision, dodging attacks by millimeters, responding with hands that fell like war hammers. Each of his blows echoed with the crunch of flesh giving way, ribs fracturing, and bones cracking. Meanwhile, enemy attacks barely brushed his clothes, like insignificant breezes. A fierce roar echoed through the rusty walls as Nate thrust his hand forward, turning it into a deadly spear that pierced a neophyte's chest. The vampire gasped, looking down at the arm now impaling his torso. Without taking his eyes off his victim, Nate plunged his other hand into the body and, with a grunt filled with brutal force, pulled his arms apart, splitting the body in two with a dry, grotesque sound. The pieces fell to the floor, scattering dust and debris. The second neophyte was paralyzed, unable to even blink. The silence that followed was so thick that the faint creaking of the old wood beneath Nate's feet could be heard. Then, like an unstoppable wave, several vampires began to bow their heads. First one, then another, until they became a kneeling crowd, arms limp and foreheads nearly touching the floor. An act of absolute, desperate submission. The paralyzed neophyte couldn't take the pressure anymore and ran off, jumping through the broken window where Nate had thrown another enemy seconds before. Come back, Victoria shouted, her voice trembling between desperation and helplessness. But the attempt was fleeting. It wasn't long before a head crashed through the broken window and rolled slowly across the dusty floor. It was hers. Seconds later, another head flew through the same opening and landed at the feet of a small neophyte, no older than 16, with messy black hair and big, terrified eyes. The girl looked down, recognizing without hesitation the severed face of the vampire Nate had thrown during the fight, who hadn't returned, now resting at her feet, still marked by panic. She looked up at Nate, and absolute fear ran through her from head to toe. Without hesitation, she knelt. Nate scanned those already on the ground, trembling and too weak to meet his gaze. Then he slowly turned toward Victoria, who watched him with a paralyzing mixture of despair, contained fury, and helplessness, seeing how her army, her control, crumbled before the monster she had unknowingly helped create. Chapter 116. Nate fixed his gaze on Victoria. It wasn't just that he was looking at her, he was piercing through her. He could see the faint tremor in her lips, the tightness in her jaw, the icy gleam in her eyes that held no trace of moisture, yet brimmed with pure, visceral fear. That dread reached him like a strong, intoxicating perfume. He inhaled slowly, as if savoring the scent of her terror, then shifted his eyes toward a more distant point. With slow, heavy steps that seemed to absorb the sounds of the factory, he walked toward the newborn he had ripped the arms off just minutes earlier. The wretch crawled like a wounded worm, awkwardly dragging himself across a floor scarred with footprints and laundry dark stains. His breathing was ragged and anxious, each movement a careful attempt to avoid making noise, as though that might save him. The silence in the room grew heavier with each of Nate's steps. Only the dragging of the crippled body and the distant drip of some liquid in a corner of the factory could be heard. Nate reached him just as the mutilated vampire was about to touch one of his severed arms. A large shadow fell over him. The newborn turned his head, and upon seeing Nate, his eyes went wide. Please, please, he stammered, voice cracked by panic. I'll do whatever you ask, I'll obey. Nate studied him in total silence for a few seconds. His eyes were cold, void of even the faintest trace of compassion. I told you there would only be one chance, he murmured. His tone was low, yet his voice carried like a deep echo that everyone could hear. He set his boot on the injured vampire's back, pressing firmly until he was completely immobilized. Then, with a movement as precise as it was brutal, he crouched, seized his chin, and in one swift pull, tore off his head. The sound was dry and devastating, a deep crack, accompanied by the crunch of bone and tendon, reverberating through the room like an electric shock. Several newborns flinched. None dared look up, some squeezed their eyes shut as if they could vanish. Nate let the head fall to the side like a useless object and began walking again. Victoria, who had witnessed it all, felt her chest tighten. She turned her head in every direction, desperately searching for an escape route. Usually, her instincts would give her a sign, a tingle pointing toward the safest option, but now there was nothing. Absolute emptiness. As though every exit had closed before she could even think of it. Nate kept advancing toward her, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats at a funeral. If you start running now, I'll catch you in the forest, a few kilometers from here, he said, his voice so cold it seemed forged from steel. He took a couple more steps. The distance between them shrank, and Victoria felt that with each lost centimeter, another thread of oxygen was stolen from her. If you escape now, I'll catch you before you reach the road. Fear climbed her spine like an icy animal crawling toward her nape. Her muscles wanted to react, but they wouldn't obey. Nate was close enough now for her to hear his slow, controlled, predatory breathing. If you run now, I'll stop you before you even leave the factory. The alarm in her head went off all at once, an internal scream forcing her to take a step back. Her body reacted, if only by pure instinct. But it was too late. Nate was already in front of her. He tilted his head, examining her. From his height, Victoria looked small and fragile. For an instant, a flicker of pity crossed his mind, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Compassion had no place here. In its stead, a silent fury began to rise, dense enough to warm the air between them. Nate felt the rage burning inside him, but it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to see her break, not just physically, but mentally. He wanted her to understand, second by second, that there would be no escape. For a moment, an image flashed in his mind, his grandmother's face. Her wrinkled hands, her serene smile, and the certainty that Victoria had ordered her death as though she were removing an insignificant piece from a board. That memory brought no sorrow, only a sharper edge to his anger. If she hadn't hesitated to kill an innocent, he wouldn't hesitate to repay her in kind, with interest. With Victoria standing before him, Nate tilted his head again, watching her with a calm far more dangerous than any scream. Not going to run? He asked, his tone deceptively innocent, dripping venom beneath the surface. But you don't look like you're going to fight either, how curious. When James was begging for his life, he said you'd be ruthless. That last remark sparked something in Victoria's chest. Rage cut through her fear, pushing it deep into her subconscious. Her muscles tensed, and in an instant, she lunged at him. With a sharp snarl, she began slashing, each strike fueled by strength and desperation. Nate dodged effortlessly, moving with a fluidity that seemed to anticipate her attacks. Yet something about her style caught his attention. These weren't polished strikes or calculated moves, but feral, rapid, erratic blows, like those of a cornered animal willing to bite until its last breath. Nate stayed on the defensive, stepping back, twisting his torso, letting her claws cut nothing but air. He even allowed a few strikes to graze him, scraping his shoulder, grazing his side, as if offering her a crumb of hope. And when he saw that spark in Victoria's eyes, when she thought she could beat him, when she believed the balance was tipping, then he acted. A brutal, swift, precise counterstrike, a reverse kick to her abdomen that knocked the breath from her lungs. The blow lifted her slightly before sending her crashing to the factory floor. The sound of the impact echoed against the metal walls. Nate didn't give her time to recover. He stepped forward and, without blinking, planted his boot on her lower back. The pressure was so great that a dull crack rose from her spine. She tried to shake him off, claw at the floor, twist to break free, but it was useless. She was completely immobilized. Victoria screamed with an almost animal fury, her voice bouncing off the metal walls of the factory. The echo distorted her words, as though the structure itself was answering her rage. She writhed under the unyielding pressure of Nate's foot, fighting to break free with desperate force. Don't just stand there. Help me. She roared, her burning gaze sweeping over each of the newborns. No one moved. They remained frozen, some with fists clenched, others staring at the floor. The smell of rust and dust thickened the air, mingling with the tension that held them in place. Nate didn't spare Victoria a glance. His attention shifted toward a trembling figure in the line, a young girl so still she seemed to want to melt into the floor. At her feet lay the severed head of the newborn, thrown in earlier, lifeless. Hey, you. Nate's voice was neutral, not raised. She lifted her face slightly, revealing wide, frightened eyes. Deep down, Nate felt a faint pang of compassion, but his expression remained unchanged. You're going to go outside. There's a vampire waiting for me. You'll tell him to come in. The girl hesitated, biting her lip as if weighing the risk. At last, she nodded silently. When she took her first step, Nate spoke again, this time in a low, dangerous tone that slid through the air like an invisible threat. At human speed. If you run, he'll think you're trying to escape. A shiver ran through her. She nodded again and walked toward the door, hurried but controlled. The old hinges squealed as it opened, the metallic sound echoing until the door shut behind her. A few seconds of heavy silence passed. Then she returned, eyes fixed on the floor as if afraid to raise them. Behind her stepped Vladimir, his silhouette framed by the light outside before he slipped into the factory's shadows. His gaze swept slowly over everything, the kneeling newborns, the shadows shaping their faces, the oppressive silence that reigned. Finally, his eyes settled on Nate, on the way he held Victoria down without the slightest effort. A faint smile curved his lips. You called for me, Nathaniel. Nate nodded and raised his voice so all could hear, his deep tone filling the space. I'll be clear. All of you here can be considered criminals by vampire standards. A barely audible murmur passed through the newborns. Some looked up briefly, only to drop their gaze again. You've drawn too much attention. And the Volturi, the absolute authority of the vampire world, will come for you. The word, Volturi, dropped like a stone in a pond. The already tense air thickened, turning nearly suffocating. But, Nate continued, those who choose to surrender will have a chance. This is Vladimir, one of the few in all history who has evaded the Volturi for over a millennium. He will lead you, and whatever he says, you will obey. He paused briefly, letting the weight of his words sink into each of them. Then his voice sharpened. If any of you try to run, I will personally hunt you down. The newborns didn't reply. They didn't need to, the fear spoke for them, hanging in the air like a dense fog seeping into every corner of the factory. They remained motionless, shoulders hunched, eyes glued to the ground. Vladimir studied each one, counting slowly, until his steps brought him beside Nate. In the industrial gloom, the vampire's eyes gleamed with a calculated glint, like the hidden edge of a weapon. I didn't expect this success, Nathaniel. Honestly, I thought at some point you'd need my help, he said, letting a faint, almost imperceptible smile curl his lips. But I see you've exceeded our expectations. 20 newborns, quite a good acquisition. Nate didn't take his eyes off the woman trapped under his boot. His expression showed no emotion, and his voice was so cold it seemed to drain the warmth from the room. How long will it take you and Stefan to make them controllable? Vladimir didn't flinch at the tone or the lack of eye contact. He allowed himself a pause, carefully choosing his words. Perhaps a few months. This isn't the first army we've trained. Nate nodded slowly. He increased the pressure of his boot until a dry crack echoed from the concrete beneath Victoria. Take them. When they're ready, we'll meet again. Vladimir regarded him, and for a fleeting moment, disappointment crossed his gaze. Seems like you're eager to get rid of us just as we start cooperating, but very well. You'll find that time moves differently now that you're immortal. We'll meet again sooner than you think. Nate looked up, ignoring the remark. They are not to feed on humans. They must remain unnoticed. Teach them to hunt animals like the Cullens, or feed them medical bags. And I want all 20 alive. Not a single one is to be lost. If you fail, I will no longer support you. A sharp glint flashed in Vladimir's eyes, too quick for most to see, but not for Nate. As you wish, he muttered with a curt gesture. Just hope you're not wasting your time. He turned and headed toward the exit. He gave no further orders, the newborns followed silently, forming an obedient line that slid into the shadows. Some, as they passed Nate, dared to glance at him, seeking in his gaze one last warning to crush any temptation of escape. He answered only with a cold, sidelong inspection. At the door, Vladimir stopped. With dark humor, he tossed one last remark over his shoulder. When you're done, don't forget to burn the bodies. His gaze swept over the scene, the mangled remains of fallen newborns, fragments scattered across the stained floor, and Victoria, panting, still trapped beneath Nate's boot. Her voice was a broken thread, begging not to be left behind, but in the factory's shadows, her plea seemed to drown beneath the sound of the door closing behind the departing army, which didn't spare her a single glance before leaving. Author's notes. If you can, please support with Power Stones or a good review. I have too many where you complained that I wasn't op law. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 117. The dimness of the abandoned factory enveloped everything. The air was thick with the rancid smell of rusted metal and old dust, and every sound, no matter how small, was amplified in that empty space. Among corroded beams and forgotten machinery, Victoria's sharp screams rose and bounced off the walls, creating an almost ghostly echo. Nate stood over her, his foot firmly pressing against the redhead's lower back. The force he exerted was not just physical, there was an icy authority in his stance, as if the entire factory bent beneath his will. His eyes, hard as steel, didn't blink. Who was it? He asked, his voice so cold and cutting it seemed to scrape the air. There were no shouts, no apparent urgency, just a frigid tone carrying the promise of something far worse than death. Victoria growled, trying to push herself off the ground with her hands to free herself, but Nate increased the pressure effortlessly. The dry crack of her spine echoed, and tiny cracks began appearing on her skin, spreading like thin black lines over perfect marble. She screamed, kicking the concrete with impotent rage. The sound of her feet pounding the dry floor mixed with the echo of her ragged breathing. I'm not going to ask again, Nate said without raising his voice, but with a weight that pierced any attempt at resistance. Who was what? Victoria retorted through screams, her voice distorted by pain and confusion. Nate's face darkened. His patience, fragile as glass, shattered instantly. He bent down sharply, his movements so fast they were barely noticed, and grabbed Victoria's right arm. The sound that followed was a dry tear, a snap that vanished into a deafening scream. The severed limb hit the floor with a hollow thud, and from the wound remained only a broken surface, like shattered stone. Who did you send to attack my grandmother? She had nothing to do with this. He roared, his voice filling the entire factory like thunder trapped between steel walls. Victoria shrank back, gasping, her body trembling from the loss. There was no blood staining the floor, but the void in her shoulder was more brutal than any mortal wound. The pain showed in every involuntary spasm, while her nails scratched aimlessly at the dusty floor. Nate breathed heavily, not from exhaustion, but from the effort to contain himself. He could feel his rage overflowing like an uncontrollable river, pushing against the walls of his self-control. If he gave in, he would end her before getting the truth. And he wasn't going to give her that easy escape. He waited. Victoria's screams gradually faded, reducing to uneven gasps, and the silence that remained was filled with the faint creak of a beam above, as if the building itself was shrinking under the tension. Tell me his name, he finally said, slow and grave, every word loaded with calculated venom, and I hope, for your sake, it wasn't one of the neophytes I've already killed, or you'll get what was meant for him. Between her kicking and Nate's foot pressing down on her back, Victoria barely managed to choke out. I don't know what you're talking about. Nate's face hardened. In a movement so fast that human eyes couldn't follow, he spun around and, with a sharp tug, tore off one of her legs. The sound of marble fracturing echoed through the place, followed by the limb hitting the concrete floor. Victoria let out a heart-wrenching scream, arching her body, but Nate gave her no room to react. He crouched, grabbed her hair firmly, and forced her to look at him. His eyes, red and cold, were like blades piercing her will. Don't lie to me. I know you sent someone to Forks. Who was it? A tremor ran through Victoria from her jaw down her body. Her voice broke when she finally spoke. His name is Riley. It's Riley. Nate frowned. That name, he'd heard it only minutes ago, whispered among some neophytes. He clenched his jaw, then released it roughly. He dropped her to the ground with a dry sound. He waited, motionless, until she stopped writhing in pain. Then his voice returned, cold as a steel blade. Where is he now? Victoria lifted her gaze, her eyes glassy with fear, and said quickly, I don't know. He was supposed to make noise in Forks, enough so the entire Cullen family wouldn't come to Seattle. Nate tilted his head, his interest sparked like a flame. What exactly was the order you gave him? Victoria swallowed out of habit, her voice heavy, dragging the words. I knew there were 2 Cullens in Seattle. The plan was to send Riley to attack the house of the girl who caused all this. That way, we'd prevent the rest of the family from leaving town. He was only supposed to attack someone close to her and return immediately. With that small window, we could hunt down the 2 Cullens here and kill them, then go to Forks for the rest. Nate didn't take his eyes off her face, analyzing every word, every gesture. But since Riley didn't come back, I thought he was dead. He said it in a dry, indifferent tone, as if the life or death of his own ally didn't weigh on his conscience. Nate, frowning with an apparently unbreakable calm, answered in a deep voice, I know he survived. Edward saw him escape. Without giving her time to react, he ordered in a dry, authoritative tone, call him back. Now. Victoria stared at him silently for a moment. A strange spark lit up in her eyes, and a small smile formed on her lips. The fear that had kept her still began to fade. I'm glad to see how much you suffer, she murmured with venomous satisfaction. That idiot finally did something right. Nate felt his fury rise through his body like an uncontrollable wave. Your entire revenge plan is stupid. You only hurt innocent people for no reason. Innocent. Victoria shouted, her voice bouncing off the factory's metal walls. None of you is innocent. You killed James. Nate didn't wait any longer. With a sharp movement, he kicked her hard, sending her flying several meters until she crashed against one of the walls. The impact echoed with a rough crack, and the structure vibrated for a moment. James attacked us. James was the one who refused to back down. I warned him myself, but that fool didn't listen. My grandmother, on the other hand, was a woman who never hurt anyone. Victoria, supporting herself with effort on her only arm, pushed herself to sit against the cracked wall. Her gaze lost focus on an undefined point, and for a moment, the fire of her hatred seemed to extinguish, revealing an unexpected vulnerability, a fragility she rarely showed. Nate approached slowly, his shadow enveloping her completely like tangible darkness. We could do this forever, he whispered, low, icy, and loaded with threat. I'll tear you apart piece by piece, wait for you to recover, and do it again. We have all eternity, just you and me. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a velvet murmur, almost a caress, as if his words could brush her skin. Or, you can tell me everything you know about Riley, and I promise I'll end you quickly. I'll even, his voice dropped to an intimate whisper, tell you James's last words, the last thing he said about how much you meant to him. Those words made Victoria react. Her eyes, once empty and dull, snapped wide open, lit by an intense flash of tension and something deeper, a genuine interest hard to hide. Victoria thought it over carefully, as if each of Nate's words weighed on her soul. Her eyes slowly scanned the shattered remains of the neophytes he had killed, then dropped to her own mutilated body, legless, armless, vulnerable. Finally, with a mix of resignation and defiance, she asked in a low but firm voice. How do I know you're not lying to me? That after I tell you everything, you'll just torture me until you're satisfied and leave. Nate looked straight into her eyes, his pupils cold and calculating, and replied in a voice that admitted no argument. What you tell me will only save me time. I keep my word. If you speak now, this will end quickly, and I'll tell you what James said. Victoria hesitated a moment longer, weighing every word, every gesture. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to break her armor, she gave in. I found him in this very city, she began, her voice trembling but clear. I was looking for someone who could protect me, someone to help me get my revenge. I found Riley. He was a tall, strong, and intelligent young man. Perfect for what I needed. I turned him by force and seduced him until he was completely in love with me. I was disgusted every second I was with him, but I pretended well enough for him to believe the act. Nate absorbed every word carefully, as if filing pieces of a crucial puzzle. Then he asked seriously. What is he like? Do you have any way to find him? Victoria nodded, describing him precisely. He's blonde, muscular, and clearly a neophyte. Then she fell silent, thinking for a few seconds before continuing. At the back of this factory, there's an old office where he and I kept some belongings. There, you might find something with his scent. If you had someone who could track him, you could find him, someone like James. Nate noticed how Victoria's face turned nostalgic, releasing a slight, almost inaudible sigh. It was clear she hadn't lied about anything she told. Slowly, he approached and took her head in his hands, a mix of hardness and solemnity. You're lucky I'm a man of my word, he said, with a threatening gleam in his eyes. Just as he was about to tear her head off, Victoria, desperate and with one last breath of hope, shouted. Wait, wait. Tell me James's last words. Nate kept pulling Victoria's head, and soon unsettling crunches began to sound, as if bones and muscles gave way under his force. But just as it seemed it was all going to end, he stopped. With an almost bored indifference, he let out a slow sound. Ah, yes. Then his voice changed, becoming grave and solemn, as if recalling an important episode from his past. That day, in the ballet studio in Phoenix, I warned James that if he attacked Bella and me, not only would he be in danger. I told him he had to think of you, because he would drag you with him. Victoria's eyes opened wide, surprised and attentive, feeling every word like a dagger piercing her mind. Nate continued, now with a light and almost frivolous tone, but loaded with meaning. He thought about it for a few seconds, and then replied. His voice grew rougher and wilder, imitating James's unique way of speaking, like a determined hunter. It's worth it for the ultimate hunt. Hearing those words, Victoria's eyes opened even wider. If she were human, tears would have streamed from her pupils. Nate's precise imitation struck her with brutal certainty. This was no liar invention. Without giving her time to recover, Nate continued, with a touch of sarcasm and harshness. I guess he did to you what you did to Riley, huh? How ironic. Victoria heard those words, and her expression changed quickly. Surprise gave way to pure and heartbreaking rage. Her screams broke the silence, filled with desperation and contained fury. Nate let her vent for a few seconds, measuring the exact moment when the storm in her voice began to fade. Then, with cold and ruthless determination, he fulfilled his promise and, with a quick, precise movement, tore her head off in a single slice, ending her suffering. Nate remained motionless for several minutes, standing in the middle of that empty factory, Victoria's head still in his hands. He let out a deep sigh that seemed to drag away part of the rage that had consumed him. That same relentless fury had now left him with a strange emptiness, a hollow sensation weighing on his chest. With slow, measured steps, his mind somewhat clouded by the events and uncertainty, he began gathering the pieces of the neophytes and Victoria's mutilated remains. He carefully piled them into a chaotic heap, a kind of macabre altar to the violence he had just unleashed. He then decided to go to the old office Victoria had mentioned. Upon entering, the dimness mixed with dust and moisture of the forgotten place. He rummaged through the belongings until he found a man's shirt, wrinkled and slightly stained. He took it carefully, folded it, and put it into a plastic bag, which he then compressed tightly to seal before storing it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He also found an old lighter, worn by time, and stored it with the same caution. Unhurried, he returned to the place where he had left the pile of bodies. He took out the lighter and, with a controlled and almost mechanical movement, lit it and threw it toward the pile. The fire spread quickly. As if the bodies were soaked in fuel, the flames rapidly consumed the clothing and lifeless flesh. Nate stood there, watching the tongues of fire dance and devour everything, while the factory glowed with a warm and dim light. In those minutes that felt like hours, a deep loneliness enveloped him. More alone than ever. He had fulfilled part of his purpose, yes, but now everything seemed meaningless. None of this served to ease the weight he felt in his soul. He wished, with an almost painful urgency, to return home. He imagined his grandmother waiting for him, as if her presence could erase all the darkness from that place. But he knew that wouldn't happen, that home no longer existed for him. His mind turned to Alice, and a wave of sadness and longing swept through him. For Nate, barely a day had passed since he last saw her, but it felt like years. An invisible force pushed him to seek her, as if her mere presence could extinguish all the bad thoughts plaguing him. He remained still, eyes closed, imagining her smile, her touch, feeling her scent nearby, and hearing her musical laughter. He stayed motionless, letting the fire and memories consume him, until a distant sound began to grow in the air. Footsteps, voices, a large group approaching the factory. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 118. Alice Pav. Alice had just opened her eyes after the vision that had consumed her from within. The cold that ran through her from her fingers to her chest did not fade. Her breathing was ragged, as if she had run a race without leaving the hotel room. Carlyle, watching her from across the room, took a calm step toward her, though concern colored his eyes. What's wrong, Alice? He asked softly but firmly, trying to contain the tension already filling the air. The rest of the group, the Cullens and the Denalis, fell into immediate silence, as if waiting for the answer they already feared. Alice couldn't hold back the anxiety strangling her throat. She jumped to her feet, eyes shining and voice breaking. It's Nate. He's here. He's going to meet Victoria. Laurent frowned, surprising more than one with the speed of his reaction. Nathaniel. Didn't you say he was safe in Washington, D.C.? Alice clenched her fists tightly, a mix of anger and fear lighting up her eyes. I knew something was wrong. We have to go immediately, we can't wait. Esme, from a corner, approached and placed a gentle hand on Alice's shoulder, trying to calm the storm she saw breaking inside her. Calm down, dear, she said kindly. If you saw it in a vision, it means we still have time. But we must act quickly. The murmurs of the group began to rise as everyone prepared to leave, grabbing their car keys with almost inhuman speed. Rosalie, standing next to Emmett, couldn't hold back a sharp, dry comment. This whole attack thing was supposed to keep that boy and Edward's girlfriend safe. And the idiot comes and just complicates things. Alice turned to her, furious, and took a determined step forward, but Carlyle was faster, placing a firm hand on her arm to stop her. Rosalie, dear, he said in a firm yet conciliatory tone, you're talking about his companion. Please, show some respect. Rosalie's eyes widened slightly. She looked at Alice, unable to hide her surprise. She had known her for many years and had rarely seen her angry. She lowered her head, a mix of shame and resignation, and murmured, I'm sorry. Emmett, with a warm smile, trying to lighten the tension, stepped forward and encouraged everyone with an energetic voice. Let's go. If we leave now, we can make sure our little brother is safe. Alice nodded, still agitated but determined. She knew the battle was not only against Victoria and her neophytes, it was also a race against time to save Nate. The group left the hotel with palpable urgency, each climbing into their cars with quick and decisive movements. Carlyle took the wheel of his own, starting firmly as the engine roared amid the city's quiet atmosphere. Alice settled into the back seat, but anxiety took hold of her almost immediately. Her leg wouldn't stop moving, a nervous tick reflecting the whirlwind of thoughts consuming her. Carlyle, eyes fixed on the road, tried to calm her with a slow, steady voice. Calm down, we'll get there on time. She glanced at him sideways, irritation bubbling beneath the surface, replying with a hint of frustration. We'd get there much faster if we sped. Esme, sitting next to her, gave a gentle smile and placed a hand on her arm to soothe her. It's still daytime, Alice. We can't just go tearing through the city. When we get to the forest, we'll leave the cars and run from there. In seconds, we'll be where we need to be. Alice nodded, but her brow remained furrowed. Every minute lost to secrecy burned her skin, but simply being surrounded by her family provided a slight refuge against the urge to rush recklessly, not caring if anyone saw her. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, everyone quickly got out of their vehicles. The stillness of the place contrasted sharply with the tension in their bodies. Without wasting time, they began running toward the factory Alice had seen in her vision, their steps fast and almost silent as they slipped between the trees, zigzagging through shadows and trunks. But suddenly, something forced them to stop abruptly. A subtle, cold, and distinctive scent floated in the air. It was strong, but they couldn't immediately identify who or what emitted it. Kate stepped forward, focusing her gift, ready to respond to the slightest sign of threat. Eleazar, eyes scanning all directions, leaned toward Carlyle and whispered. Do you think it's Victoria? It doesn't smell like a neophyte. Carlyle frowned thoughtfully. I don't think so, but there's something about that scent that feels strangely familiar. Alice, silent, took a deep breath and let her mind make the connection before her lips spoke. The smell was unmistakable, a scent she had felt before, one of the Romanions. Without waiting any longer and unable to contain the urgency burning inside her, she shouted. Where is he? Where's Nate? The group's eyes turned to her, puzzled by the sudden outburst of anxiety. Then, from inside the forest, a sharp, clear whistle broke the silence. Alice didn't hesitate for a moment. She lunged toward the sound, her steps quick and determined among the roots and dry leaves. The others followed, perplexed but adrenaline-fueled. After moving a long stretch, they stopped suddenly. The whistle sounded again, closer this time. Looking up, they saw Stefan perched in the treetop, a wide smile on his face that seemed to mock them as he watched from above. The Denali sisters immediately bristled, their gazes tense and alert as if they had smelled a danger they did not want to face. But Carlyle broke the silence. Stefan, what are you doing here? Alice didn't wait for Stefan's answer. Anxiety and anger propelled her to raise her voice forcefully, addressing him without filter. Tell me where he is. They dragged him here, didn't they? Stefan let out a low, almost mocking chuckle, his face taking on a haughty and contemptuous expression. We don't drag anyone around, girl. And honestly, I don't like your tone. Then he turned his head to look at Carlyle with a mixture of mockery and challenge. Looks like you haven't raised your coven well, Carlyle. Carlyle frowned, clearly confused, and turned his gaze back to Alice, waiting for answers. How do you know the Romanions? And what did they have to do with Nate? Alice was about to answer, the tension in her chest tightening with each second, when something suddenly dropped in the middle of the group. A dirty, torn shirt full of scratches. The scent it gave off was unmistakable. The Cullens recognized it instantly. It was Nate's smell. Alice reacted without hesitation. With overflowing fury, she jumped toward where Stefan was, who at that moment dodged by leaping to another treetop. Stefan moved with feline agility, jumping from branch to branch, fleeing Alice with a shrill laugh that sounded almost like a game to him. The combined Cullen and Denali group, still not fully understanding the situation but instinctively supporting Alice, began chasing Stefan. They knew any information he had about Alice's partner had to be revealed if they caught him. The chase continued intensely, the group moving between the trees with supernatural agility. Stefan, slippery and playful, zigzagged between trunks, throwing loud laughs that seemed to mock his pursuers. He jumped skillfully from branch to branch, as if the forest were his natural home, making every attempt to catch him difficult. On more than one occasion, Kate was about to reach him with a swift move, but Stefan always escaped at the last moment, disappearing among the treetops to reappear at a safe distance. Emmett, with his impressive strength, tried to close the circle, catching branches or deflecting obstacles, while Rosalie ran with fierce precision, calculating every jump and turn. Jasper watched attentively, reading the emotions emanating from Stefan. He's too happy, almost like this is a game for him, he commented quietly, sharing his unease with Carlyle. The united Cullen and Denali team kept pace determinedly, although the forest seemed to stretch endlessly as Stefan led them farther and farther from the factory Alice had seen in her vision. The vampires' muscles showed no fatigue, but the feeling of losing track began to wear on the group's spirits. Then Irina, with a worried tone, pointed out the obvious. Hey, we're moving further away from the factory. What if this is a trap? Kate huffed in frustration, but didn't lose focus. She prepared to act while Emmett took a firm position on the path. In a quick, coordinated move, Emmett placed his open hands as a step. Kate used that momentum to launch herself forward, flying between the trees with precision and speed. The impact was decisive. She managed to touch Stefan just in time. Kate's psychic energy exploded on contact, stunning Stefan immediately. The vampire collapsed, unable to maintain the balance or agility that had characterized him until then. The group wasted no time and quickly closed in to trap him. Stefan lay on the ground, still staggering as Kate's gift left him dazed. The group surrounded him cautiously, never lowering their guard for a moment. Carlyle waited a few seconds for him to recover before speaking. These are not the best conditions for a reunion, Stefan, but you obviously know something about the partner of one of my daughters. Tell us where he is. Stefan let out a low, mocking laugh, fully recovered, and rose with haughty elegance, staring at every member of the group surrounding him. Alice could no longer hold back. Her voice trembled, full of urgency and desperation. This isn't a game. You know he's in danger. He can't face Victoria. Tell us where he is, now. Stefan's laugh faded, and his expression turned dark, almost threatening. I think it's us who now know Nathaniel a little better, he said in a low, grave voice. I can assure you he's safe. The words cut deep into Alice, who reacted with a fear far more intense than she expected. She couldn't imagine what kind of situation the Romanions might have put Nate in. Kate, impatient and not letting the conversation drag on, stepped forward. We don't have time for games, she declared harshly. With a quick move, she grabbed Stefan's neck and used her gift strongly. Stefan's confident expression cracked into one of immediate pain. He began twisting on the ground, trying to resist the power dominating him. The seconds felt endless until the effect finally passed. In a hoarse voice, Stefan murmured, I hate how unfair some abilities are. He turned to look at Alice with a mixture of challenge and resignation. I don't know why you come to me when you should already know where Nathaniel is, with those supposed visions of yours. Alice's body froze. She realized she had let emotions take control and that they had lost precious time. Without another word, she turned and started running determinedly toward the factory she had seen in her vision. Alice, wait! Carlyle shouted, but the clan leader didn't hesitate. He began chasing her quickly. The Cullens hurried to catch up, their steps firm and determined. The Denalis remained momentarily still, exchanging worried glances. Kate asked seriously, what do we do with him? Tanya, with a determined voice, answered, the most important thing now is to face the neophytes. We can't let the situation get out of control. The Denali group nodded, and without wasting more time, they started running in the direction the Cullens had gone, except Laurent, who stayed a bit behind, paralyzed by uncertainty. Stefan watched him with a cold, biting smile. It's been a while, hasn't it? He said ironically. I hope when the sides form, you choose well, Laurent. Without waiting for a response, Stefan disappeared into the forest with agility, vanishing among the shadows. Laurent stood thoughtfully for a few seconds before clenching his jaw and firmly following the path the others had taken. When the Cullens reached the factory's outskirts, the tension in the air was palpable. Alice, anxious and unable to wait a second longer, tried to advance toward the entrance, but Emmett held her firmly before she could step. Calm down, little sister, Emmett said calmly, though with a slight urgency. We can't rush. Alice kicked and frowned, wanting to enter immediately. Jasper, standing nearby, extended his concentration and used his gift to try to calm her, sending waves of serenity toward Alice. Little by little, Alice began to yield, and Emmett loosened his grip, though she remained tense, ready to act. They waited a few seconds until the others arrived, and with the full group gathered, they began sniffing the air. The silence surrounding them was unsettling. It was Laurent who spoke first, nervously but decisively. I feel the trail of the neophytes, but I don't hear anything. Also, the trail seems to be moving in another direction. Alice, a little calmer, freed herself from Emmett and sniffed the environment carefully. I sense Nate's scent, she murmured. Though it's too faint, everything is too mixed with the neophytes' smell. The group advanced cautiously, almost as if they were hunters in a silent hunt. Each step brought them closer to the factory but also increased confusion. There was no sound, no clear sign, only the sensation of a presence inside. Everyone undoubtedly felt that a vampire was there. Possibly a neophyte. The gray smoke rising from one of the high windows confirmed that someone was active inside. With dilated pupils and senses on high alert, they approached slowly until they stood right in front of the factory's facade. Kate was the first to break the silence, with a firm but hurried voice. It's definitely only one. I'll take care of it, she said, pushing herself forcefully and jumping toward a high window, breaking the glass without hesitation. Tanya tried to stop her with a hand on her arm, but it was too late. For a few seconds, nothing was heard except the sound of Kate's fast footsteps. Suddenly, a crash broke the silence. Everyone turned their gaze to the window Kate had entered through. She was violently thrown out, falling hard to the ground. Her face tensed in pain as she held her stomach, where small cracks began to show on her skin. Kate! Tanya exclaimed, running to her, while the others prepared for whatever might come out of the factory. Eleazar, who had remained silent since they arrived, finally spoke with a deep, worried voice. I feel there's a vampire with a gift inside, he said, frowning, a pretty powerful one, but I can't quite understand what it can do. Laurent, standing beside him, slowly closed his eyes, inhaling deeply as if trying to absorb the very essence of the place. Then, in a grave and almost hypnotic tone, he added. Yes, I can sense that power. It's intoxicating, almost overwhelming. Kate, though still in pain, got up swiftly and gently brushed away Tanya's restless hand, trying to hold her back. I don't know exactly what happened, she confessed with a hint of frustration, but there's only one man inside. I didn't even manage to touch him before he kicked me like I was nothing. Her gaze dropped to her stomach, where the cracks that had appeared were quickly closing, as if her body was urgently regenerating. Also, it's clear he's very strong. Tanya, frowning with a serious expression hardened by the moment's gravity, took command without hesitation. Whoever he is, he must know what happened with the neophytes, and he's dangerous. Everyone. Let's surround the factory and attack at the same time. The group nodded silently, each feeling the weight of the imminent confrontation. With coordinated, swift movements like shadows, they spread out, each taking position in a different sector around the old factory. The air was charged, tense, as they waited for the exact moment to assault. Then, in an almost simultaneous act, they jumped inside the factory. In the center of that large, gloomy room, lit by flames devouring a pile of bodies, a man stood with his head down, as if absorbed by that macabre vision. The Cullens froze upon seeing him. Without hesitation, the Denalis launched themselves toward him, ready to unleash their attack. But just as they were about to pounce, a scream cut through the air, sharp and urgent. Wait! It was Alice's voice, vibrant and full of a strange mixture of fear and hope. The Denalis stopped abruptly, their bodies tense and their looks full of questions. Alice stepped forward cautiously, breathing fast, her gaze fixed on that figure. Her voice, barely a whisper filled with disbelief, pierced the silence. Nate. The man slowly lifted his head. Time froze as Alice's golden eyes met Nate's intense red ones. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 119. Alice stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Nate. The deep blue she remembered in his eyes was gone, replaced by a glowing red that burned like embers in the shadows. It wasn't the gleam of a newly turned vampire struggling to contain his thirst, there was something deeper in his stare, a dark weight that seemed to anchor him to a silent pain. His figure was imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with defined muscles, Nate seemed to occupy more space than he truly had. The dim light filtering through the rusted cracks in the structure slid across his pale skin, highlighting the sharp lines of his face and the hardness in his jaw. There was no hesitation in his stance, he was a predator surveying the terrain, fully aware of his strength. Alice took a step toward him. Then another. The faint echo of her movements blended with the muffled murmur of the wind slipping between the metal walls. Jasper moved quickly, stepping to her side. His cold, firm hand closed around her forearm. Wait, he murmured, his voice deep and low, just for her. His emotions are too unstable. Nate's eyes narrowed at the sight of Jasper's touch. It was barely a change in his expression, yet the air in the room seemed to thicken. There was no sudden move, but the latent threat became sharper, as if the calm around him was a mask that could shatter at any second. Alice turned her head toward Jasper. Her face was a mix of irritation and determination. He won't hurt me, she stated with unshakable certainty. She brushed off his hand with a decisive motion and kept walking, her eyes locked on Nate. The Cullens watched in silence, each reacting differently. Carlyle and Esme looked at him with a mixture of sadness and compassion, as if they could see beyond the vampire he had become and remembered all that he had lost along with his humanity. Rosalie and Jasper remained cautious, their watchful eyes ready for the slightest sign of aggression. Emmett, however, frowned slightly, there was something oddly familiar about Nate's presence. It was like that primal instinct from his human days, when he had once come face to face with a bear in the woods, that cold certainty that you were standing before something that could kill you in an instant. Nate was surrounded by them, two full covens, yet he didn't seem cornered. His stillness wasn't that of someone feeling threatened, but of someone who knew that if tension broke, he would have more than a fair chance of getting out unharmed. The air was heavy, dense, and every second that passed without a word made it feel as though something was on the verge of erupting. Alice was now only a few steps away from him. The Denali coven watched as she closed the distance with firm strides. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and even though none of them had known Nate as a human, the scene before them was leaving a powerful and difficult-to-ignore impression. Eleazar studied him with narrowed eyes, like a mathematician facing an equation that refused to be solved. There was something about Nate that didn't fit, an enigma that challenged even his experience. Beside him, Carmen, sensing the growing discomfort saturating the room, gently clung to her partner's arm, seeking in that gesture a silent refuge from the tension. Tanya let her gaze travel slowly over Nate, lingering a moment too long on his face. Even among vampires, his features were extraordinary, and the halo of mystery and danger around him stirred in her a curiosity that was hard to suppress. Kate, on the other hand, regarded him with a different sort of interest. The memory of the strength with which he had repelled her still resonated in her mind. Very few vampires had ever bested her, and the quiet confidence radiating from Nate was as intriguing as it was challenging. Irina, however, kept her eyes mostly on Alice. In an instant, she understood the connection between them, and the worry reflected on her friend's face struck her with a pang of sorrow. In contrast to the other's expectant silence, Laurent was smiling. It wasn't a warm smile, but rather the proud expression of someone who felt vindicated in their past decisions. His gift allowed him to sense the tide of power flowing from Nate like an invisible pulse, and deep down, he congratulated himself for having turned his back on James that day in the clearing. Oblivious to the stares around him, Nate saw only Alice approaching. His eyes, cold and calculating by habit, slowly softened, letting a crack of vulnerability escape. Inside, he wanted to close the distance as much as she did, but he was acutely aware of the invisible gap between them. For a moment, he saw her as if she were made of glass, fragile, ethereal, and dangerously precious. A weight settled in his chest as he realized that perhaps this was how Alice had felt about him all along. He stayed perfectly still, watching her until she stood before him. Alice, with a touch as soft as a feather, lifted her hand and placed it against his cheek. She tilted her head slightly, forcing their eyes to lock onto each other. They stayed like that, unmoving, as if they were meeting again for the first time after an eternity. Nate, in a slow and deliberate motion, began to lift his hands toward her. He hesitated for a heartbeat, as though afraid to break the moment, and finally wrapped his arms around her. With as much gentleness as his nature allowed, he pulled her close, holding her in an embrace that was more confession than physical contact. Alice was not surprised. She rested her head against his chest, closed her eyes, and let herself be wrapped in the calm he radiated. The world around them seemed to fade away. Nate's expression grew somber, marked by a regret that weighed heavily on his soul. His voice, deep and velvety, barely louder than a whisper, broke the silence. I'm sorry it took me so long. Alice tightened her hold on him, still with her face buried in his chest, whispering softly, "It doesn't matter, the only thing that matters is that you're safe." They stayed like that, clinging to each other as if the rest of the world no longer existed. The stillness of the moment was heavy, and each passing second seemed to stretch, filled with a silence that said everything. The warmth of that embrace was strange for two such cold bodies, but the sense of home it carried was unmatched. The moment was shattered with a cough that sounded foreign, intrusive. Tanya stepped forward, wearing a polite half-smile, though her eyes held urgency. "Sorry, Nate, right. We don't want to interrupt your reunion, but we need to find Victoria and her army before they get farther away." Her gaze shifted toward the burning pile of bodies, the fire crackling and casting unsettling shadows across them all. From the looks of it, her army's out of control and killing each other. Now would be a good time to attack. Emmett cut in, unable to contain the curiosity boiling under his skin. "Forget that for a second. How are you a vampire? Who bit you? And how did you get here so fast?" Nate, still holding Alice as though letting her go was unthinkable, lifted his gaze to him. His expression turned cold again, his deep voice carrying a final tone. "Victoria and her army won't be a problem anymore. I took care of it." He tilted his head slightly toward the burning corpses, as if that alone explained his words. Rosalie frowned, incredulous. "Wait, you took them all out by yourself?" Carlyle, who had been silent until then, spoke with a mix of surprise and concern. "That's madness." His eyes narrowed in thought, and after a few seconds, he added, "But we sensed a trail of newborns heading in another direction, and that pile isn't as big as it should be. Did some get away?" Nate didn't hesitate for a moment. "Most surrendered when I started killing them. They just wanted to live, Victoria was manipulating them, and I gave them the chance for another life." Carlyle's gaze softened immediately, as though something in those words touched him deeply. Nate felt a faint weight of discomfort at the reaction, though it didn't show on his face. Kate stepped forward, her tone sharp and loaded with disbelief. "Wait, you just let them go. They're newborns. They'll cause a massacre." Nate looked straight at her. His piercing red eyes made Kate instinctively step back. The tension in the air grew dense, as if his gaze alone had cut right through her. "I told you, I took care of it, and I take responsibility for them," he said in a deep, measured voice, each word falling with weight. "If anything happens, Alice will see it in her visions, and I'll deal with it." No one seemed entirely convinced, but his tone left no room for argument. It was the voice of someone who didn't ask permission, who didn't seek approval. Jasper, with a look that made it clear he'd rather not ask, broke the silence. "And what about the vampire who attacked Forks? Did you take care of him, too?" Nate's gaze hardened even further, as if the temperature around him had dropped. "No. I have no idea where he is, but he wasn't here. I made sure of that." Carlyle, who had been watching every movement, seemed to be piecing things together in his mind. He clapped his hands once, sharply enough to cut through the tension, and spoke calmly. "I think we all have plenty of questions, but with that vampire still out there, we'd better return home to support Edward. We don't know if he might come back." Emmett, still processing what had happened, frowned. "But what about Nate? He can't just go back like this. And there's the funeral for his grandmother." His voice trailed off abruptly. Realizing what he'd just said, guilt flickered across his face as he glanced at Nate. Nate lowered his gaze for a moment. A shadow of melancholy crossed his features, and when he spoke, it was in a low but steady tone. "I'd like to return to Forks to take care of that, but I don't trust myself to be around humans right now. I think I need some time to adjust." Carlyle, with quiet understanding, took a small step toward him. "I'll do what I can to delay the funeral for a few months. I'll keep the ashes until you're ready. I'll use your absence as an excuse to postpone it." Nate nodded slowly, a nearly imperceptible glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. Alice, still pressed against Nate's chest, seemed to think for a moment before speaking with a determined tone. "I'll go with him for a while, somewhere far from humans, at least long enough for Nate to gain enough control to return to Forks." Carlyle nodded with calm understanding, as if he fully grasped the need for that time and space. Emmett, unable to hold back his impatience, spoke again in a slightly tense voice. "So you're not going to explain? You're not going to tell us what happened here? How you suddenly a vampire? I've got too many questions." Alice tightened her embrace on Nate, stepping in to answer for him with calm firmness. "We have plenty of time to catch up. For now, it's best if you all return to Forks, and I'll spend this time with my partner." Emmett huffed, resigned, and reluctantly backed down. Everyone exchanged brief glances, laden with mixed emotions, until Tanya, seeking to ease the tension, spoke kindly. If you're looking for a place, you can stay with us. We don't live too close to humans, there aren't as many scents in the snow, and if your partner loses control, Kate, along with the rest of us, could incapacitate him. Nate seemed to consider the offer, his eyes scanning each of the gathered vampires, weighing the silent calculations passing through his mind. Laurent stepped forward, insisting gently but firmly. Yes, you should come, Nathaniel. The Denali house is the perfect place to get your thirst under control. Nate looked at them for a few seconds, then turned to Alice. She smiled at him with complete trust and nodded without words. He returned a small smile, a mix of gratitude and relief, before speaking to the group. I'll take you up on that. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Jayjayempi Creator's Thoughts. Chapter 120. If you want to support or read some advanced chapters +10, please follow me on patreon.com/jjmp. The Denali family received the news that Nate and Alice would be staying with them for a while with evident satisfaction. Among knowing looks and kind gestures, it was Laurent who showed the greatest enthusiasm. His lips curled into a brief smile, but in his eyes ignited a calculating gleam that did not go unnoticed. With Eliezer's experience and gifts, he could help you better understand yours, whatever it may be, he said softly, his voice smooth as a caress, though charged with a curiosity that seemed to measure every reaction from Nate. Nate did not let himself be swept up by their enthusiasm. He remained upright and still, that absolute stillness that seemed inherited from death itself. He merely nodded briefly, without disturbing the unchanging calm on his face. The Denalis then mentioned they would be taking a plane back home to Alaska. The idea of distance and isolation seemed like the perfect refuge for anyone seeking silence, but Nate kept his gaze low as he responded. I'd rather go on foot. I wouldn't like being locked up with so many humans for so long. The phrase echoed softly in the muted factory space, filtering through the rusty beams and suspended dust. None of those present tried to persuade him. They all understood, more or less, that for someone like him, being too close to so much human blood was an unnecessary risk. The farewells were brief, measured hugs, handshakes that didn't try to hold on. Before leaving, Tanya barely nodded toward Alice, drawing a half smile on her lips. We look forward to your arrival. The Denali group walked away amid the hollow sound of their footsteps on cracked concrete, their silhouettes blending with the dusk outside. The Cullens lingered a few seconds longer, as if no one wanted to break that fragile calm moment. Jasper stepped forward, placing himself in front of Nate. There was no distrust in his gaze, but a meticulous scrutiny, like someone listening to an irregular heartbeat. Nate held eye contact with the same serenity, and deep down, part of him found it ironic to recall that not long ago, standing in front of the Cullens had seemed like a mortal risk. I have trouble controlling my thirst, too, Jasper said in a warm tone that contrasted with the underlying edge in his words. If you want, I can go with you to Alaska. I could use my gift to calm you, I can feel how your emotions rise and fall too quickly. Nate observed him silently. The stale air stirred his hair slightly before a faint smile appeared on his lips. I appreciate that, but I won't always be able to rely on your gift to keep myself controlled. It's best to learn the hard way first. The silence that followed was dense but not uncomfortable. Jasper nodded with silent respect before looking away and heading toward Esme, who waited with her hands clasped in a calm expression, as if she had anticipated the response beforehand. Emmett approached afterward, his shadow stretching long over the rust-stained floor. There was a spark of amusement on his face, as if the earlier tension had dissipated. He raised his hand to give a friendly pat, but Nate moved with feline speed, effortlessly dodging the contact. Emmett let out a low laugh, unbothered. He looked at Nate differently now. After seeing him hold Alice so delicately, Nate no longer seemed like a latent threat, but a strange predator capable of containing something fragile without breaking it. I hope that when you come back to Forks, you tell me the whole story of your transformation, Emmett said, crossing his arms with a competitive gleam in his eyes. I also want to see what you can do now. Nate held his gaze for barely a moment before nodding politely, without adding a word. Esme, almost as if waiting her turn near Jasper, took a few steps toward them. Her walk was silent but gentle. She stopped in front of Nate, her eyes filled with a tenderness that needed no explanation. Although the circumstances aren't ideal, she began softly, I want to welcome you to our family. I know I could never replace your parents or grandmother, but now that you're with Alice, as one of us, I hope you can trust me as you would a member of your own family. Nate looked at her as if weighing the weight of each word. Then, a minimal smile, so fleeting it might have been imagined, appeared on his lips. I hope to be in your care. The gesture lit a light on Esme's face. She nodded affectionately before returning to Rosalie, who waited a few steps behind. The blonde looked at him for only a moment, as if wanting to say something, but then her attention drifted toward one of the broken windows, lost in thoughts she did not share. Carlyle, who had calmly followed every interaction, raised his voice with natural authority. Go ahead to the vehicles, he instructed the others. I just need to finalize some details with Alice and Nate before joining you. The rest of the Cullens nodded silently, giving Nate and Alice a last glance before disappearing in a swirl of air and dust, melting into the shadows of the old factory. Carlyle watched them leave with a faint smile that faded almost immediately, replaced by a heavy sigh. He slowly turned to Nate, fixing his golden eyes on him with a mixture of curiosity and warning. Now then, he said firmly but not hostilely. I stayed silent because I thought there had to be a good reason, but I can't pretend ignorance if you're putting yourselves in danger. What do you have to do with Vladimir and Stefan? His words echoed in the large empty space, as if the peeling walls returned the sound. Carlyle took a step forward, his voice growing serious. They don't work for anyone, and it's clear Stefan was distracting us to give you time. I wasn't the only one who noticed, maybe that's why Tanya offered her home. But I also smelled Vladimir here. It's clear he left with the newborns. So, Nate, what's going on? The silence that followed was dense, charged with invisible tension. Nate, far from looking away, held the gaze with calculated calm. Alice, sensing Carlyle's direct and piercing scrutiny, instinctively moved closer to Nate and hugged him at the side, as if to place herself between him and any threat. Nate gave Alice a brief, calm smile, a gesture more to reassure her than himself. Then he looked back at Carlyle. Honestly, I was only planning to tell Alice, he confessed in a low, almost intimate tone but heavy with intent. But I think it's good you know too, I just hope this stays between us. Carlyle held the gaze without blinking, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. You have my word, Nate. Nate's expression changed sharply. His features hardened, and the warmth he had shown moments before vanished, replaced by calculated coldness. My father was involved with them, he began, his voice low but heavy with a weight that resonated in every syllable. He discovered them, and in exchange for letting him live, they asked him to find people with the potential to awaken abilities. Carlyle's eyes widened, surprised by the magnitude of the revelation. Alice, who already knew the story, said nothing, she only tightened her grip on Nate, her fingers clutching his clothes as if she could protect him from a memory that had already marked him. Nate continued, not averting his gaze from Carlyle. My father found several prospects, but for different reasons, couldn't recruit any. In the end, the Romanions asked him to locate a child of the moon, who was in DC. They wanted to use him as a weapon against the Volturi. Carlyle nodded slowly, his look growing more grave. We are forbidden any dealings with the children of the moon. The Volturi have hunted them for centuries, they say they are immune to vampire gifts. I understand why they would want to use them. Nate tilted his head slightly, accepting the observation. My father found him. He tried to help him, to understand him. And in the end, he convinced him to talk to the Romanions. But the Volturi arrived first. His eyes darkened, and the tension in his jaw betrayed him before he spoke the next words. They forced the wolf to kill my father, then killed my mother. Alice, unaware of that last part, opened her eyes in disbelief. Her grip grew firmer, as if to anchor him to herself. Carlyle, who had already suspected a tragic ending, let his face show silent compassion. Nate took a breath, as if finishing the story required one last effort. In the end, we found the Romanions in DC. I helped them find the wolf, and he confessed everything himself. Carlyle, somewhat subdued, lowered his voice. So, the Romanions now have the support of a child of the moon. Nate slowly shook his head. They don't. I killed him myself. Both Carlyle and Alice reacted instantly, though differently. Surprise showed on their faces, but Alice felt no pity for the child of the moon. What disturbed her was imagining Nate risking himself without what she considered a sufficient reason. Carlyle leaned forward, incredulous. What? So, you were already a vampire then? Alice gave you the bite. Alice shook her head firmly, her voice tinged with reproach. If he had been a vampire before I left, I wouldn't have been so worried about him. Then she turned her head toward Nate, her eyes evaluating him with a mix of anxiety and suspicion. Did the Romanions bite you? Did they force you? A flash of anger lit Alice's gaze, like a spark threatening to become a fire. Nate ran a hand slowly down her back, trying to ease the tension gripping her. No, he answered calmly. I asked for the bite. I killed the wolf while still human. After killing him, the Romanions talked to me. They only wanted to manipulate me, but they said something that convinced me. His tone changed, becoming sharper as he looked away from Alice to fix Carlyle with a cold stare. The coldness of his gaze contrasted with the warmth he shared with his partner. Carlyle, why didn't the Volturi intervene when the presence of newborns became more evident in this city? Carlyle seemed stunned by the question, as if the weight of those words cracked his usual calm. He remained silent for a few seconds, long enough for the tension to thicken in the air of the old factory. The Volturi don't act over every little thing that happens in the vampire world, he finally answered, measuring each word. They might have intervened at another time, when the situation attracted more attention. It was lucky they didn't. If they had interrogated Victoria, they would have found out about you and Bella, and we would have had no choice but to turn them. Nate nodded briefly, though unease lingered in his eyes. So, what will happen to Charlie? He was present when the newborn attacked my grandmother. He was the target himself. Do you think the Volturi will let your family leave the secret so exposed? Even if you don't tell me, Charlie and Bella already know the truth. And there's also the pact with the Quileutes, Alice's visions, besides you being the second largest clan, not counting your close relationship with the Denali. His eyes narrowed, and his voice grew colder, almost calculating. If I were Arrow, I'd see you as a potential threat. Carlyle reacted with a slight expression of skepticism, though his eyes showed a flicker of concern. You're letting your resentment take over, Nate. The Volturi wouldn't attack us without reason. We've lived in peace for a long time. They know me, they know I would never crave their power. Also, Charlie hasn't awakened yet, we don't know how much he remembers. He saw Jacob transform, maybe the shock erased some memories or made him think much of it was a dream. Nate blinked, surprised by the mention of his friend's transformation, but didn't let the reaction show beyond a slight raising of his eyebrows. His voice, however, was direct and sharp. So your bet is to leave your family's safety to the goodwill of others. Maybe you're okay with that, Carlyle, but I'm not that stupid. Alice, who had been watching Nate's every gesture, noticed the fury igniting in his gaze. Softly, she placed her hand on his face, as if trying to put out that fire. Please, don't talk to my father like that. The contact seemed to ground him, and Nate relaxed his shoulders. Carlyle shook his head softly before speaking, his tone full of patience. I understand you, Nate, I really do. But I don't want to spend my eternity always expecting the worst. I believe in the goodness of people. I believe that as long as we stay peaceful, no one will mess with us. I've lived like that for centuries, and I've never regretted it. Nate studied him carefully, as if weighing those words. His reply came in a murmur, but with the strength of unbreakable conviction. You really remind me a lot of my father, Carlyle, but I can't live that way. I won't stand by and watch the people I love get killed again. Carlyle intervened quickly, his voice harder now. And you're going to protect them by joining the Romanions. Starting a war. Nate, the Romanions won't hesitate to sacrifice everything you love to achieve their goal. They're just using you. Nate shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on Carlyle's, each word charged with intent. No, Carlyle, I'm the one using them. Nate took a deep breath before speaking, as if organizing thoughts he had long held back. The Romanions are desperate. They hide behind that haughty facade, those confident smiles, but deep down, they'd already given up. They thought that if they waited long enough, a third faction would rise against the Volturi. And then, they met me. His voice hardened, but his eyes shone with something more calculating. I'm their last hope. Since I found out about my grandmother, I swore I wouldn't let something like that happen again, especially not to someone I love. At that moment, he turned his head toward Alice. His gaze changed completely, from cold and calculating to a deep, almost painful softness, as if everything he was saying had in her its most intimate reason. I pretended to accept their war. I showed them what I could do, made it clear that not even together could they defeat me. I got them strength, a small army of newborns to start with. But what they don't understand is that they aren't loyal to them. He looked back at Carlyle, harshly. They fear me. I terrified them on purpose, enough so that they would never dare imagine betraying me. The Romanions will waste time training them, filling their heads with stories against the Volturi, convincing them I came to free them. They will do whatever I tell them. As long as they believe I have a plan, the Romanions will wait centuries if needed. And if they're right, if in the end they come looking for Alice somehow, then I'll have the power to respond. Not just with the newborns. The Volturi have sown seeds of dissatisfaction throughout their reign. I just have to find those people, those waiting for the slightest excuse to rebel. If the worst case comes, we won't be defenseless. Carlyle and Alice looked at him, mouths agape. Carlyle was silent for a few seconds, weighing every word, until he spoke quietly. Your plan has too many inconsistencies, Nate. The Romanions could betray you. What you're doing could leak out. The Volturi could think you're gathering an army to overthrow them, to take their power. Even I have my suspicions. And, even if you don't seek to rule, the Romanions must not return to power. The times they ruled were terrible, for humans and vampires alike. The Volturi, though imperfect, maintain some order in the world. They are necessary. Nate smiled calmly, without offense. I can guarantee you I'm not interested in power. I just want to spend my eternity in peace. That's always been my wish. And I promise you the Romanions will never rule again. But I think it's best we leave this conversation here. The only thing you should care about is that I will keep Alice, and your family, safe. Everything I do and will do will be under that principle. He leaned slightly forward, with quiet but firm conviction. I've thought about all your concerns myself. Since I turned, the answers have come with more clarity than ever. I won't do anything that puts my partner in danger, but I won't be defenseless either. You must trust me on this. I have several plans in mind. And if at any point you feel I'm putting yours at risk, don't hesitate for a second to turn me in. Your family should always be your priority. Carlyle stood still, looking at him with a mixture of surprise and warmth. Nate, but now you're part of the family too, he said with a sincerity that caught him off guard. Nate raised his eyebrows slightly, and although his face didn't change drastically, a faint, tired smile appeared on his lips. It was a subtle gesture, but enough for Alice to feel a glimpse of the human Nate she once knew, a fleeting spark of vulnerability. No words were spoken for several seconds. Silence settled, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was dense, filled with questions neither father nor daughter wanted to ask at that moment. Alice and Carlyle decided, without saying it, that those answers could wait. Carlyle was the first to break the pause, his voice tinged with resignation and some hope. I hope you know what you're doing, Nate, though I think you always have. I said it the first time you entered my home, and I say it again now, you're extraordinary. I just ask one thing, never lose sight of what truly matters. Nate held his gaze silently, as if weighing the weight of those words, and finally nodded. Alice, thoughtful, held a little tighter to his arm, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. I think I'll be going then, Carlyle continued, preparing to leave. One more thing, Nate, I hope you can talk to Edward and Bella soon. Bella is worried about you, and Edward, he paused while weighing his words, doesn't know how to face you. He's a good boy, and believe me, he did everything he could. Don't hold it against him. Nate looked at him with a neutral expression, not allowing emotions to show. Then he replied in a controlled tone. When I feel ready, I'll find them. First, I want to control my thirst. In my emotions, Jasper was right when he said I'm a bit unstable. Alice gave him an understanding smile. That's normal, Nate. It happens to all newborns. He returned the gesture, silently grateful for her support. Carlyle smiled warmly, and just as he turned to leave, Nate stopped him. Wait, before you go, I have a question. You know many vampires, right? Carlyle, not fully understanding where this was going, tilted a smile. Yes. I've been in contact with many clans and covens. Why? Nate thought for a few seconds, as if weighing the importance of what he was about to do. Finally, he reached inside his jacket and began searching for something.